My twin brother and I had not spoken in 10 years. But when he called me from a smuggled prepaid phone at 2 in the morning, weeping and begging for his life, I knew I had to act. His own sons had kept him locked in a backyard shed for 6 years, treating him worse than a stray animal while they drained his life savings. When I finally found him, I did not call the police. That would be far too easy for them. Instead, I sent my brother to a secure hospital, put on his filthy clothes, and locked myself inside that very same shed. His sons thought they were dealing with a broken old man. They did not know they had just locked a predator inside their own backyard. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe those who abuse family deserve absolutely no mercy. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. The night air in the upscale Atlanta suburb was thick and humid, but the cold rage burning inside my chest made me oblivious to the temperature. I stood in the manicured backyard of the sprawling house that actually belonged to my brother Vincent. The house was entirely dark. His sons, Terrence and Andre, were inside, sleeping comfortably on expensive mattresses bought with their father's money. Beside me stood Malik, my head of security and former Chicago police detective. Malik held a heavy pair of bolt cutters. He looked at the rusty padlock securing the wooden doors of the dilapidated garden shed at the far edge of the property. I gave him a single nod. Malik clamped the cutters onto the thick steel lock and pressed down hard. The metal snapped with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet night. Malik pulled the broken lock away and slowly opened the wooden doors. The smell hit me first. It was a suffocating wave of stale, urine-rotting wood and pure human despair. I pulled a small tactical flashlight from my coat pocket and shined the beam into the pitch-black space. The shed was no larger than a walk-in closet. There was no heating and no air conditioning. The floor was bare concrete, stained and damp. In the far corner, huddled on a filthy, mold-infested mattress, was a frail figure. He was wearing tattered sweatpants and a shirt that was practically rotting off his shoulders. He threw his bony arms over his face to shield his eyes from the sudden light. "Please, Terrence," he whimpered. His voice was a dry, raspy croak that barely sounded human. I did not ask for anything. I did not make a sound. "Please, do not turn off the water again." My heart stopped beating for a full second. The flashlight trembled in my hand. 30 years of running a massive commercial real estate empire in Chicago had turned my blood to ice water. I had destroyed rival developers and crushed corrupt politicians without blinking. But seeing my own flesh and blood reduced to a trembling skeleton completely shattered my composure. Vincent and I were identical twins. We shared the exact same face, the exact same height, and the exact same deep brown skin. But that was where the similarities ended. I was the wolf. I built my fortune through sheer ruthless determination in the brutal world of Chicago real estate. Vincent was the sheep. He was a gentle, mild-mannered accountant who always saw the good in people. He trusted easily and he forgave quickly. 10 years ago, a stupid, petty argument over a family property had driven a wedge between us. My stubborn pride kept me from reaching out. His gentle nature made him too timid to fight back. I had left him alone, and because I left him alone, his greedy sons had turned him into their prisoner. "It is not Terrence," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "It is me, Vince. It is Victor." The frail figure stopped shaking. He slowly lowered his arms. The flashlight beam illuminated his face. It was like looking into a distorted, horrifying mirror. His cheeks were hollow. His eyes were sunken and bruised. His gray beard was matted and overgrown. But they were my eyes. He stared at me in total disbelief. "Victor," he whispered, his voice breaking into a wet sob. "You came. You actually came." I stepped into the foul-smelling shed and knelt on the damp concrete. I pulled my twin brother into my arms. He weighed almost nothing. I could feel every single rib pressing against his thin skin. He buried his face in my expensive cashmere coat and cried like a frightened child. I held him tightly, ignoring the stench of decay. I felt a profound, sickening guilt for abandoning him. But right behind that guilt, a dark, calculating fury began to take shape. "We need to call the authorities," Boss Malik whispered from the doorway, keeping a watchful eye on the dark house. "This is a severe felony. We need an ambulance and a police squad right now." I pulled back and looked at Vincent's bruised face. "If we call the police, what happens?" "Terrence and Andre will hire expensive defense lawyers using my brother's own stolen money. They will claim he has dementia, They will drag this out in court for years while they hide his assets offshore. They will get a slap on the wrist for elder neglect. No, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous rumble. The police are not getting involved tonight. Malik frowned. Then what is the play, boss? Take him to the car, I ordered. Drive him straight to the private medical facility downtown. I already paid the chief of medicine to prepare a secure VIP recovery suite. Nobody asks questions there. Tell them to run a full blood panel, treat his infections, and feed him. Put a security detail on his door. He does not leave that room until I say so. Malik gently lifted Vincent off the moldy mattress. Vincent clung to Malik but looked back at me with terrified eyes. "What are you going to do, Victor?" he asked weakly. "I am going to get your life back, little brother," I promised him. "Now go. You are safe now." Malik carried Vincent across the dark lawn and disappeared into the shadows toward our waiting vehicle. I was left entirely alone in the shed. I stood up and looked around the miserable wooden box. I saw a dirty plastic bucket in the corner that served as a toilet. I saw an old dog bowl on the floor, crusty with dried food residue. My nephews had treated my brother like a dog. I took off my expensive cashmere overcoat and folded it neatly. I took off my tailored suit jacket, my silk tie, and my crisp white shirt. I stripped down until I was standing in the cold night air. I reached down and picked up the extra pile of filthy rags Vincent had been using as a pillow. The smell was absolutely putrid. It smelled of sweat and old garbage. I did not hesitate. I pulled the stained shirt over my head and stepped into the torn sweatpants. I bent down and scooped up a handful of damp soil and ash from the corner of the concrete floor. I rubbed the dirt aggressively into my face, my neck, and my gray hair. I smeared the grime over my arms and hands until my skin looked just as neglected and abused as Vincent's. Because we were identical twins, anyone looking quickly would simply see the same broken old man they had been tormenting for 6 years. A few minutes later, Malik returned quietly to the shed holding a new heavy steel padlock that I had instructed him to purchase on our way here. It looked exactly like the one he had just broken. "He is in the car," Boss Malik whispered, looking at my dirty clothes and grimy face with deep concern. "Are you absolutely sure about this? You are a 74-year-old man. If they get physical with you inside this box, I might not be able to reach you in time." I looked Malik dead in the eyes. I survived the Chicago South Side, and I built a real estate empire by breaking men who thought they were untouchable. Two spoiled, arrogant brats are not going to break a sweat on my brow. "Lock the door, Malik. Do not return until I send the signal." Malik nodded, handing me a tiny encrypted earpiece and a microscopic cellular device disguised as a simple black button. I slipped the devices deep into the pocket of the filthy sweatpants. Malik pulled the wooden doors shut. The heavy metal padlock clicked securely into place. I was locked inside the dark, foul-smelling shed. I walked over to the moldy mattress and sat down. The damp cold seeped immediately into my bones. I pulled my knees to my chest and leaned my head against the wooden wall. I spent the entire night sitting in the pitch-black darkness, listening to the sounds of the wealthy suburb. I thought about the 6 years of agony my brother had endured in this exact spot. I absorbed his pain. I let the cold air fuel my hatred. I mentally prepared every single step of the total financial and psychological annihilation I was about to unleash upon my nephews. Hours passed. The temperature dropped and then slowly began to rise again. The thin cracks in the wooden walls began to glow with the pale blue light of early morning. The sun was coming up. The house was waking up. I heard the distant sound of a sliding glass door opening. Then the sharp, distinct clack of high heels striking the concrete patio. The footsteps moved purposefully across the manicured lawn, heading straight toward the shed. It was Chloe, Terrence's wife, the woman who wore designer clothes bought with my brother's blood. The footsteps stopped right outside the wooden doors. I heard the jingle of keys. A key slid into the padlock. The heavy metal latch clicked open. I quickly laid down on the moldy mattress, curling myself into a tight ball and shielding my face with my dirty arms just as Vincent had done. I slowed my breathing and began to tremble slightly, playing the role of the terrified prisoner perfectly. The wooden doors swung wide open. A blinding ray of bright morning sunlight poured into the dark shed, hitting my face like a physical blow. "Wake up, you useless old man!" a sharp, arrogant female voice snapped. The shadow of a woman stepped into the doorway, blocking the sun. I peered through the gaps between my fingers. Chloe stood there holding a plastic dog bowl in one hand and a smartphone in the other. She had a disgusted smirk on her face, completely unaware that she had just opened the door to her own destruction. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. The bright morning sun burned my eyes as the wooden shed doors swung wide open. The shadow of a woman stepped into the doorway, completely blocking the light. It was Chloe, my nephew Terrence's wife. She stood there looking down at me with an expression of absolute disgust wrinkling her perfectly powdered nose. She was dressed immaculately in a crisp white blouse and tailored designer slacks. The contrast between her pristine appearance and the vile, rotting stench of the shed was sickening. In her left hand she held a cheap plastic dog bowl. It was blue-scratched and stained around the edges. She did not kneel. She did not speak a word of greeting. She simply tossed the bowl onto the damp concrete floor. It slid across the rough surface and hit the wall near my mattress with a dull clatter. A gray lump of cold leftover oatmeal and watery powdered milk spilled over the edge, landing on the dirt. "Eat up, you useless old man." Chloe snapped, her voice dripping with venomous arrogance. "You are lucky we even bother to feed you. You do not do a single thing but sit out here and waste our resources." I kept my arms wrapped tightly around my knees. I had to remember that I was not Victor Pierce, the billionaire real estate developer right now. I was Vincent, the broken captive. I forced my shoulders to shake violently. I let out a soft, pathetic whimper, making sure my voice sounded exactly like the raspy, broken croak my brother had used the night before. "I'm sorry, Chloe," I mumbled, pressing my face against the filthy mattress. "I am so sorry. I will be good." Chloe scoffed loudly. "You have been saying that for 6 years, you senile parasite," she sneered, resting her hands on her hips. "Just eat the food and keep your mouth shut. Terrence has guests coming over later, and I do not want them hearing you moaning out here like a dying animal." Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stand up. I wanted to rise from that moldy mattress, grab her by the collar of her expensive white blouse, and show her exactly what kind of animal she had just locked herself in a cage with. I had dismantled powerful, corrupt politicians and destroyed ruthless corporate raiders in Chicago. Dealing with a spoiled, arrogant thief would have taken me less than 10 seconds. But I pushed the rage down deep into my stomach. I locked it away in a cold, dark box. Premature action would ruin everything. I needed them to feel completely safe. I needed them to hang themselves with their own rope. I slowly uncurled my body from the mattress. I made my hands tremble exaggeratedly as I crawled across the cold, damp concrete floor toward the plastic dog bowl. My knees scraped against the rough stone. The smell of the cold, congealed oatmeal was nauseating, but I did not hesitate. I reached the bowl and reached out with my shaking, dirty fingers. "Wait," Chloe suddenly commanded. I stopped, freezing my body in place like a terrified dog waiting for a command. I looked up at her through the gaps in my dirt-smeared fingers. Chloe reached into the pocket of her tailored slacks and pulled out the latest model smartphone. She tapped the screen, unlocking the camera, and pointed the lens directly at me. A bright flash illuminated the dark corners of the shed. "Terrence is going to love this," she laughed, a cruel, sharp sound that echoed in the tiny space. He had a stressful morning dealing with the real estate brokers. A video of his pathetic father eating breakfast out of a dog bowl is exactly what he needs to cheer him up. "Go on, old man. Eat for the camera. Give my husband a good show." I stared at the black lens of her smartphone. She was recording a video to mock my brother. They were treating his starvation and humiliation as morning entertainment. The level of sociopathic cruelty was staggering. I lowered my head, trembling, and scooped a handful of the cold, tasteless oatmeal into my mouth. I chewed slowly, forcing myself to swallow the vile mixture. I let a little bit of it spill down my chin to complete the pathetic image. Chloe laughed again, zooming in on my face. "That is right. Eat your slop. You look exactly where you belong." As I kept my head bowed, eating from the plastic bowl, my eyes scanned her posture. I looked past her phone and noticed the handbag slung over her left shoulder. It was an iconic design. The leather was pristine Togo calfskin in a rich, golden caramel hue. The hardware was solid palladium. It was an Hermes Birkin bag. I knew luxury goods intimately. I bought authentic Birkin bags for my late wife years ago. I knew the exclusive waiting lists. I knew the massive retail prices. The bag resting casually on Chloe's shoulder cost at least $20,000 on the resale market. My mind calculated the horrifying reality in a fraction of a second. Neither Chloe nor Terrence had legitimate high-paying careers. Terrence was a mid-level manager at a logistics firm before he mysteriously quit 6 years ago, right around the time Vincent supposedly lost his mind. Chloe had not worked a single day in her life since marrying my nephew. They did not buy that $20,000 handbag with hard-earned money. They bought that bag with Vincent's money. They bought it with the pension my brother had worked 40 years as a loyal accountant to build. They bought it by draining his retirement accounts, cashing his Social Security checks, and locking him in a rotting shed to starve. I swallowed another handful of the cold oatmeal. The taste of the food vanished, replaced entirely by the bitter metallic taste of pure, absolute hatred. I was eating leftover garbage off a concrete floor while this arrogant thief flaunted my brother's stolen wealth on her shoulder. I did not break character. I kept shivering. But beneath the dirt and the grime on my face, my mind was already actively liquidating her future. I was going to strip that bag from her hands. I was going to strip the designer clothes from her back. I was going to reduce her to nothing but an orange prison jumpsuit. Okay, that is enough footage, Chloe said, tapping her phone screen to stop the recording. I cannot stand the smell in here for another second. It is making me nauseous. She turned around to leave her expensive high heels clicking against the concrete. But before she could step out of the doorway, a large shadow fell across the lawn. A man stepped into the frame, blocking the sunlight. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a thick, trimmed beard. He wore a fitted designer polo shirt and expensive golf slacks. It was my nephew, Terrence. I had not seen Terrence since he was a young man at a family barbecue 10 years ago. Back then, he was a polite, quiet kid who always seemed a little too eager to please. Now he looked like a man utterly corrupted by unearned wealth and absolute, unchecked power over a helpless victim. "Did you get the video, babe?" Terrence asked, his voice deep and completely devoid of any familial warmth. "I got it," Chloe replied, stepping aside to let him enter the shed. "It is hilarious. He is practically eating the plastic." Terrence smirked and stepped fully into the shed. He looked down at me with an expression of profound irritation. He did not see a father who had raised him. He only saw an annoying obstacle. I stayed on the floor, crouching near the dog bowl, waiting to see his next move. Terrence did not speak right away. He took 2 steps forward, and without any warning, he swung his right foot. The toe of his expensive leather loafer slammed directly into my ribs. The physical impact was sharp and sudden. I let out a loud, dramatic gasp, rolling onto my side and clutching my chest. The pain was real, but I exaggerated my reaction, curling into a tight fetal position on the damp floor. I whimpered loudly, begging for him to stop, just as Vincent would have done. "Get up, old man," Terrence barked, pulling a folded stack of thick legal papers from his back pocket. "I do not have time for your pathetic whining today. The buyers are getting impatient." I stayed on the floor, gasping for air, peering up at him through my dirt-covered arms. "What buyers?" I stammered, my voice shaking. "Terrence, please do not hurt me anymore." Terrence crouched down, bringing his face close to mine. I could smell the expensive mint mouthwash on his breath. He unrolled the legal documents and shoved them right in front of my face. He pulled a silver pen from his shirt collar. "This is the final power of attorney authorization," Terrence said, his voice dripping with cold, calculated malice. "I need your signature right here on the dotted line. The commercial property downtown, the one you swore you would never sell, has a cash buyer waiting. The holding company approved the transfer, but the title company insists on a fresh signature from the primary owner to clear the final escrow check." I stared at the documents, pretending to be completely bewildered by the legal terminology. "I do not understand, Terrence," I whimpered. "My building. You are selling my building. I am selling everything," old man Terrence sneered, pressing the pen into my trembling hand. "Your accounts are dry. The pension is not enough to cover our lifestyle anymore. This land sale brings in $5 million cash. Now sign the paper before I break another one of your ribs." I held the pen weakly, letting it shake against the paper. "And what happens to me, Terrence?" I asked, forcing a tear to run down my dirt-smeared cheek. Terrence stood back up, looking down at me with a victorious, completely heartless smile. "What happens to you?" He laughed cruelly. "You have outlived your usefulness, old man. As soon as the ink dries on this contract and the money hits my offshore account, we are done playing nurse. I already paid off the state medical board. We have a transport van coming on Monday to drag you to the state psychiatric asylum. You are going to spend the rest of your miserable life locked in a padded room strapped to a bed." Chloe giggled from the doorway, pulling her luxury bag higher onto her shoulder. "And do not worry about visitors," she added maliciously. "We will be far too busy spending your money on a beach in Monaco to come see you." "Sign it!" Terrence demanded, nudging my shoulder with his shoe again. "Sign it right now." I looked down at the signature line. The document was a complete transfer of assets. It was the final nail in my brother's financial coffin. They thought they had secured their fortune. They thought they were sending a broken old sheep to the slaughterhouse. They did not know they had just handed a loaded gun to a wolf. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. I lay on the damp concrete floor of the shed, clutching the silver pen Terrence had just shoved into my hand. My ribs ached from where his expensive leather shoe had connected with my side. I kept my head down, hiding the cold, calculating focus in my eyes behind a mask of dirt and fake tears. Before Terrence could force me to sign, another shadow fell across the open doorway. A second man stepped into the shed. It was Andre, my other nephew, the younger brother. He was 35 years old, wearing a tailored linen suit that looked completely ridiculous in this filthy backyard. He held a leather briefcase and looked at his phone with an expression of pure anxiety. "Did you get the signature yet?" Terrence Andre demanded, his voice tight and high-pitched. "We are running out of time. The brokers are calling and the lenders are getting extremely impatient. We cannot keep stalling them." "I am getting it right now," Andre Terrence snapped back. "The old man is just being difficult today. He is putting on a show for Chloe. He thinks if he cries enough, we will let him back into the main house." Chloe gagged from the doorway, holding a manicured hand over her nose. "I cannot breathe in here," she complained, turning away in absolute disgust. "The smell is making me sick to my stomach. I am going back to the house to pour a mimosa. Hurry up and get the papers signed, Terrence. I want to book the first-class flights to Monaco this afternoon before the prices go up." We heard her high heels clicking away across the stone patio. It was just the three of us left in the dark shed. Two arrogant predators and a wolf wearing a sheepskin. Andre stepped closer, crouching down next to his older brother. He did not even look at me as a human being. He looked at me like a broken, automated teller machine that was taking too long to dispense cash. "Just grab his hand and force the pen," Andre said, wiping a bead of sweat from his forehead. "We need the commercial plot cleared today. If we do not wire the signed collateral agreement to the holding account by noon, the syndicate is going to pull the funding entirely. You know what happens if they pull the funding, Terrence? They are going to want their advance back with a massive penalty. These are not bankers. They are monsters." Terrence glared at his younger brother. "I know how the syndicate works, Andre. Do not lecture me about risk. Just give me a second. Look at him. He is a complete mess." I seized the opportunity. I let my hands shake violently, dropping the silver pen onto the dirt. I let out a loud, pathetic wail, wrapping my arms around my ribs. "I cannot see," I whimpered, keeping my voice frail and broken. "The letters are too small. Where are my reading glasses? Please, boys. I do not know what I am signing. Do not take my building. It is all I have left for your mother." Terrence let out a loud groan of frustration. He reached down into the dirt and picked up the pen. He grabbed my wrist roughly, pulling my arm forward with brutal force. "You do not need to read it, you senile fool," Terrence growled. "It is just the final transfer deed. You already agreed to it last month. We are putting the money into a high-yield savings account to pay for your medical care. You need professional help, old man." He shoved the thick stack of legal papers right up to my face. He pointed to the dotted line at the bottom of the final page. While Terrence and Andre bickered over the time frame, I did what I had done for 40 years in the cutthroat Chicago real estate market. I scanned the document. My eyes darted across the dense legal paragraphs. I did not need glasses. My vision was perfectly fine, and my mind processed complex financial contracts faster than any corporate lawyer in the state. It only took me 10 seconds to read the key clauses, and what I saw made my blood run absolutely cold with a mixture of horror and supreme satisfaction. They were not just selling my brother's commercial land. The document was far more sinister than a simple real estate transaction. It was a cross-collateralized loan agreement. They were using the commercial property located in a highly lucrative retail district as a blind guarantee to secure a massive high-interest cash loan. I looked at the name of the lending entity printed at the top of the page. It was a holding company known in the underworld as a front for a notorious underground syndicate. They were taking a shark loan from men who broke legs and burned houses down for late payments. I scanned the amounts listed on the second page. They were borrowing $5 million in pure, untraceable cash. and the destination for the funds was listed as a ghost startup company called Pierce Innovations, a company with no employees, no product, and no actual revenue. Terrence and Andre were not just stealing from their father. They were committing massive corporate fraud on a terrifying scale. They were taking $5 million from highly dangerous criminals and using their father's remaining property as the sole collateral. When their fake startup inevitably vanished with the cash, the syndicate would move to seize the commercial building. If the building did not cover the exorbitant interest rates, the syndicate would come looking for blood. They thought they were building a flawless exit strategy. They thought they could take the cash flea to Monaco and leave a senile old man locked in a psychiatric ward to take the fall when the mob came collecting their debts. It was a beautiful, meticulously planned crime born out of pure greed. But it had one fatal flaw. It required the legal signature of Vincent Pierce to bind the collateral. I stared at the dotted line. If I signed my brother's name, I would legally bind his estate to a violent criminal syndicate. I would complete their fraud and give them the $5 million they needed to escape the country. I could never let that happen. But if I refused to sign, they would simply force my hand or forge it later themselves. I needed to give them exactly what they wanted while simultaneously planting a bomb that would obliterate their entire plan from the inside out. I picked up the silver pen with my trembling, dirt-covered fingers. "Sign it right now," Andre shouted, checking his luxury watch again, pacing back and forth in the confined space. "We have 30 minutes to scan this to the broker. If we miss the window, we are dead." "I am signing," I whimpered, letting tears fall onto the thick parchment paper staining the edges. "I am signing it for you boys. I love you both so much." I pressed the pen to the paper. I stopped the violent shaking in my right hand for exactly 3 seconds. I channeled 40 years of signing million-dollar acquisitions and authorizing ruthless corporate takeovers. I did not write the name Vincent Pierce. I signed my own name, Victor Pierce. My signature is highly distinct. It features sharp, aggressive angles and 2 very specific complex hooks on the capital V and the capital P. It is a signature registered on hundreds of federal tax documents, corporate charters, and banking institutions in Illinois. It is a signature that legally belongs to a multimillionaire holding absolutely no ties to the commercial property listed in the document. The moment I finished the final loop, I resumed my pathetic trembling. I dropped the pen and let my hand fall weakly to the concrete floor, acting completely exhausted by the effort. Terrence snatched the document away instantly. He did not look at the ink. He did not verify the spelling. Arrogance and greed create the thickest blindfolds in the world. He only saw ink on a dotted line. He only saw his $5 million payday becoming a reality. Finally, Terrence sighed, standing up and brushing the dust off his trousers. That was the last piece of the puzzle. He handed the stack of papers to Andre, who quickly shoved them into his leather briefcase, snapping the brass lock shut with a loud click. Andre let out a heavy breath of profound relief. "I will drive this straight to the broker. We will have the cash in the holding account by 1 o'clock, then we start packing." Terrence looked down at me one last time. His eyes were completely devoid of any human empathy. He was looking at a piece of garbage that had finally served its ultimate purpose. "Enjoy your weekend in the shed," Old Man Terrence said, kicking the plastic dog bowl closer to my face. "The transport van arrives on Monday morning. They are going to put you in a nice, soft jacket so you do not hurt yourself. Try not to make a mess before then." Andre did not even look back. He was already walking out of the shed, dreaming of the millions he thought he had just secured for his luxurious new life. Terrence followed him, pulling the heavy wooden doors shut. The shed was plunged back into total darkness. The heavy steel padlock clicked into place, locking me inside once again. I sat in the pitch-black silence, listening to their footsteps fade across the grass. I heard the distant roar of Andre's sports car engine starting up and speeding away down the suburban street. I slowly pushed myself up off the damp concrete floor. I wiped the fake tears from my dirty cheeks. I reached into the pocket of the filthy sweatpants and touched the small encrypted communication button Malik had given me. My nephews thought they had just won the lottery. They thought they had secured their wealth and disposed of their father permanently. They did not realize what they had actually done. By accepting that document, they had just submitted a fraudulent signature to a violent criminal syndicate. The contract was legally null and void because Vincent Pierce never signed it, but the Sharks would still release the $5 million based on the fraudulent guarantee provided directly by Terrence and Andre. When the syndicate inevitably discovered that the collateral contract was a forgery, They would not go looking for a senile old man in a psychiatric ward. They would know they had been deliberately conned by the two brothers who brokered the deal. The syndicate did not care about legal loopholes. They only cared about their money. Terrence and Andre had just personally stolen $5 million from the most dangerous men in the city. They had just signed their own death warrants without even reading the fine print. I smiled in the dark. The first trap was successfully set. The financial slaughter was already in motion. Now it was time to address the medical conspiracy. It was time to find out exactly how they had kept my brother hidden for 6 years without a single doctor or neighbor asking questions. I waited patiently in the dark, letting the hours pass. I needed the sun to go down completely. I needed the house to fall entirely asleep. Because tonight, the broken old man in the shed was going to go for a walk, and the secrets hiding inside that beautiful house were going to be dragged out into the cold, harsh light. I waited in the pitch-black shed for hours. The temperature dropped steadily as the sun disappeared. The damp cold crept up from the concrete floor and settled deep into my bones, but I did not shiver. I sat completely still. I listened to the sounds of the neighborhood fading away. I heard the distant hum of highway traffic slow down to a quiet whisper. I heard the lights in the main house click off one by one. I waited another 2 hours just to be absolutely certain. A predator does not rush. A predator waits until the prey is completely defenseless in their sleep. I stood up in the dark. I stretched my arms and legs, letting the stiff muscles loosen. I walked over to the corner of the shed where they kept broken gardening tools and rusted junk. I ran my hands over the debris until my fingers brushed against a thick, heavy piece of rusted iron. It felt like a broken pry bar. It was exactly what I needed. I walked to the wooden doors. I wedged the flat edge of the iron bar into the gap between the heavy steel padlock and the rotting wood of the door frame. I am 74 years old, but I spent my youth working construction on the south side of Chicago. My hands are still built like vice grips. I shifted my weight and applied massive leverage, pulling down on the iron bar with all my strength. The rusted screws holding the latch plate groaned under the pressure. I pushed harder. The wood splintered with a sharp crack. The entire locking mechanism tore free from the rotted door frame. I caught the heavy padlock in my hand before it could hit the concrete floor and make a sound. I pushed the wooden doors open. The cool night air hit my face. It smelled like fresh-cut grass and expensive landscaping. I stepped out of the foul-smelling shed and onto the pristine lawn. I was a ghost moving through the shadows. I walked across the backyard, keeping my footsteps light and silent. I approached the back patio of the massive house. This house was purchased by my brother Vincent decades ago. He worked late nights doing taxes for small businesses just to afford the down payment. Now his arrogant son slept in the master bedrooms while he rotted in a wooden box. I reached the heavy glass sliding doors at the back of the house. They were locked, of course, but Terrence was a lazy man who relied on expensive alarm systems instead of basic security. Before I entered the shed, Malik had handed me a tiny electronic scrambling device. I pressed the small black box against the glass near the alarm sensor. A green light blinked twice, indicating the perimeter alarm was temporarily disabled. I pulled a thin lock-picking tool from the pocket of my filthy sweatpants. It took me less than 30 seconds to bypass the simple mechanical lock on the sliding door. I slid the glass door open just enough to slip my body inside. I stepped into the kitchen. The contrast between the freezing shed and the climate-controlled luxury of the house was nauseating. The floors were polished marble. The countertops were imported granite. The appliances were top-of-the-line stainless steel. Every single item in this room was bought with stolen money. I walked through the kitchen, leaving faint traces of dirt from my bare feet on the pristine floors. I did not care. I was not planning to leave without getting exactly what I came for. I moved silently down the hallway toward the front of the house. I remembered the layout from the blueprint Malik had pulled from the county records. I knew exactly where Vincent's old study was located. Terrence had claimed it as his own home office. I turned the brass handle and stepped inside. The study smelled like expensive cigars and leather. It was the scent of a man trying desperately to play the role of a successful tycoon. I closed the door quietly behind me and locked it. The heavy curtains were already drawn shut, blocking out the streetlights. I walked over to the massive mahogany desk in the center of the room. Sitting on the desk was a high-end desktop computer. The monitor was asleep. I pressed the power button. The screen illuminated the dark room with a soft blue glow. The login screen prompted me for a password. Terrence probably thought his files were perfectly safe behind a digital wall. But Malik had also provided me with a customized universal serial bus drive preloaded with a military-grade decryption algorithm. I plugged the small metal drive into the side of the computer. The screen flickered black for a second. Lines of green code cascaded down the monitor as the algorithm bypassed the operating system completely. In less than a minute, the desktop appeared. I had total unrestricted access to every file, every email, and every financial record Terrence had ever saved. I inserted a second high-capacity storage drive into the computer. I initiated a complete system mirror. I wanted everything. While the data transfer progress bar slowly crept across the screen, I opened the primary document folders to see exactly what kind of monster my nephew really was. I bypassed the folder labeled Pierce Innovations. I already knew his startup was a hollow shell used to launder the shark loans. I searched for folders related to my brother. I found a hidden directory titled Medical Legal. I clicked it open. The files inside detailed a conspiracy so vile it made my stomach turn. I found bank statements showing massive wire transfers made 6 years ago. The transfers were sent to an offshore account belonging to a man named Dr. Evans. I recognized the name immediately. Dr. Evans was a prominent neurologist in the Atlanta area. He was highly respected in the medical community. I opened a scanned document attached to the wire transfers. It was an official medical evaluation dated 6 years ago. The document bore the official letterhead of Dr. Evans' private practice. The evaluation claimed that Vincent Pierce had suffered a rapid and severe onset of advanced dementia. It detailed fabricated symptoms including violent outbursts, extreme paranoia, and total memory loss. It was a complete and utter lie. Vincent was perfectly healthy 6 years ago. He was sharp and capable. Terrence and Andre did not just lock their father in a shed. They bought a corrupt doctor to legally erase his existence. They paid Dr. Evans hundreds of thousands of dollars to create a fraudulent medical history. That fake diagnosis was the foundational document they used to seize power of attorney and strip Vincent of his human rights. The doctor had sold his medical oath and my brother's life for a stack of dirty cash. I stared at the glowing screen, reading the clinical descriptions of my brother's fake insanity. The rage inside me burned hotter than the surface of the sun. Dr. Evans thought he was safe sitting in his expensive clinic, writing fake reports for greedy children. He did not know I was going to rip his medical license to shreds and throw him into a federal prison cell right next to my nephew's. I memorized his name. I memorized his address. His destruction was officially added to my schedule. I checked the data transfer progress bar. It was at 90%. The computer was quietly copying the last batch of financial ledgers and email archives. I stood perfectly still, watching the green bar inch forward. 92%. 95%. Then I heard it. A floorboard creaked loudly on the second floor right above my head. I froze. I held my breath, listening intently. The house was supposed to be completely asleep, but the distinct sound of footsteps echoed through the ceiling. Someone was awake. Someone was walking down the carpeted stairs. The footsteps were light but deliberate. They were moving toward the first floor. They were moving toward the kitchen. I looked at the monitor. 98%. I could not pull the drive yet. If I interrupted the mirror process, the encrypted files might corrupt. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. They were clicking softly against the marble floor of the hallway. It was Chloe. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of her slippers gave her away. She was probably coming down for a glass of water after a night of drinking expensive wine bought with my brother's blood. 100%. The screen flashed a completion notification. I yanked both metal drives out of the computer port and shoved them deep into my pocket. I hit the power button, killing the monitor instantly. The study plunged back into total darkness. I moved silently across the room, my bare, dirty feet making zero sound on the thick rug. I unlocked the study door and slipped out into the hallway just as the kitchen light clicked on. I had nowhere to run. The hallway was too long and the back patio door was on the other side of the kitchen. If I moved down the hall, she would see my shadow. I needed to hide immediately. I stepped quietly toward the open kitchen door. I pressed my body flat against the wall, sliding right behind the heavy wooden door itself. The space between the door and the wall was incredibly narrow. I sucked my stomach in and held my arms tight against my sides. The stench of the dirty sweatpants I was wearing was overwhelming. I prayed the smell of stale urine and mold would not drift into the kitchen and alert her. I held my breath. I slowed my heart rate down to a slow, steady thump. I became a statue hidden in the dark crease of the house. Through the crack near the door hinges, I could see into the kitchen. Chloe was standing by the large stainless steel refrigerator. She was wearing a silk robe. She poured herself a glass of filtered water. She took a slow sip, running her free hand through her blonde hair. She looked entirely relaxed, unaware that a man who could snap her neck in a single second was standing less than 5 feet away from her. She turned around holding the glass of water. She took a step toward the hallway, preparing to head back upstairs to her comfortable stolen bed. Then she stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes fell on the pristine white rug situated right in front of the sliding glass patio doors. The moonlight shining through the glass illuminated the fabric perfectly. Right in the center of the expensive white rug was a distinct muddy footprint. It was a perfect impression of a bare human foot made of dark wet soil from the backyard. I had tried to walk lightly, but the damp earth from the shed had clung to my skin. Chloe stared at the muddy footprint. The relaxed, sleepy expression vanished from her face. She lowered the glass of water slowly. She looked at the locked sliding glass door. She looked at the muddy print again. Her breathing hitched. The silence in the kitchen became absolutely terrifying. She knew someone was inside the house. I stood frozen behind the door. My muscles coiled tight like loaded springs. I waited in the dark, ready to strike if she turned her head. She stared at the footprint, and her hand slowly reached into the pocket of her silk robe, searching for her phone. The hunt was getting dangerous. The game was escalating. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. I stood frozen behind the heavy kitchen door, waiting for Chloe to make her move. She stared at the muddy footprint on the pristine white rug. Her hand hovered over her silk robe pocket where her phone rested. She took a sharp breath. But arrogance breeds laziness. She let out an annoyed sigh, shaking her head. She muttered under her breath, complaining that Terrence had tracked mud into the house again after checking the perimeter. She did not call the police. She did not wake her husband. She simply turned around and walked back up the carpeted stairs to her warm bed. I waited until I heard her bedroom door click shut. I slid out from behind the kitchen door, slipped through the glass patio slider, and vanished into the dark backyard. I locked myself back inside the rotting shed just as the first hint of morning light breached the horizon. I had the encrypted drive safely in my pocket. The night was a complete success. A few hours later, the sound of gravel crunching under heavy tires woke me from a light sleep. A luxury vehicle had pulled into the long driveway. I heard 2 sets of footsteps approaching the shed across the grass. One set belonged to Terrence. The other set was distinct with the sharp, solid tap of expensive leather dress shoes. The heavy steel padlock rattled and clicked open. The wooden doors swung wide, letting the bright morning sun pour into my miserable concrete cell. Terrence stood in the doorway. Beside him was a man in his late 50s wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying a vintage leather medical bag. He had perfectly styled silver hair and the polished, arrogant demeanor of a man who spent more time on the golf course than in an operating room. I recognized his face instantly from the medical files I had downloaded the night before. It was Dr. Evans, the corrupt neurologist who had sold my brother's freedom for a stack of dirty cash. "Make it quick," Terrence said, leaning against the wooden doorframe checking his phone. "I have a meeting with the real estate brokers in an hour to finalize the commercial land transfer. Just do the basic evaluation and update the guardianship chart." Dr. Evans smiled a greasy, professional smile. "Do not worry, Terrence. This is just a routine compliance check to keep the state medical board satisfied. I will be done in 5 minutes. Terrence nodded and walked away to take a phone call on the patio. Dr. Evans stepped into the dark shed, pulling a pristine white handkerchief from his suit pocket to cover his nose against the foul stench of the room. He looked down at me with absolute boredom. He did not see a patient. He saw a highly profitable administrative chore. "Well," Vincent Dr. Evans sighed, opening his leather medical bag on a rusted metal barrel. "Let us get this over with. Just nod your head so I can note that you are responsive, and I will be on my way." I knew this was my only window. I needed to test the depth of his corruption. I needed him to admit his crimes out loud. I pushed myself up from the moldy mattress. I dropped the trembling, confused act. I looked directly into his eyes, making my gaze sharp, lucid, and completely desperate. "Doctor, please. I whispered, keeping my voice low and urgent. You have to help me. I am not crazy. I am completely lucid. My sons are keeping me prisoner here. They are stealing my money. They are forging my signatures. You have to call the police. I can pay you. Whatever they are paying you, I can pay you double. Just get me out of this shed. Dr. Evans stopped arranging his medical tools. He looked at me. He saw the clear, intelligent desperation in my eyes. A real doctor would have immediately recognized a sane man begging for his life. A real doctor would have called the authorities instantly. But Dr. Evans was not a real doctor. He was a highly paid mercenary in a white coat. He slowly lowered his handkerchief. A cold, cruel smirk spread across his face. He let out a soft, highly amused chuckle that echoed off the wooden walls of the shed. He looked at me not with pity, but with profound, arrogant amusement. You are offering to pay me, Vincent. Dr. Evans laughed, shaking his head. That is a generous offer. But unfortunately for you, your sons already manage your bank accounts. You do not have a single dime to your name. He reached into his leather bag and pulled out a small glass vial and a fresh plastic syringe. He expertly pierced the rubber stopper and drew a thick, clear liquid into the plastic barrel. He tapped the side of the syringe with his manicured fingernail to clear the air bubbles. I am not sick, I pleaded, crawling a few inches forward on the damp concrete. You are a doctor. You took an oath. Look at me. Examine me. You know I do not belong in a psychiatric ward. Dr. Evans sighed dramatically, stepping toward me with the loaded syringe. I know exactly what you are, Vincent. You are a cash cow. Terrence pays me $50,000 a year in untraceable offshore wire transfers just to sign a single piece of paper every 6 months. That paper says you have severe advanced dementia. That paper keeps your sons in control of your estate and keeps my boat docked in the marina. He crouched down, holding the needle up to the light. You see, Vincent, nobody cares about an old man locked in a shed when a respected medical professional signs a legally binding diagnosis. You can beg and you can plead, but outside these wooden doors, you are officially a ghost. Now give me your arm. Terrence asked me to administer a heavy sedative. You have been too noisy lately, and he needs you quiet for the transport van on Monday. He reached out with his left hand to grab my shoulder. He held the needle in his right hand, preparing to plunge it directly into my neck. He thought he was dealing with a frail, broken accountant whose spirit had been crushed by 6 years of solitary confinement. He thought I was helpless. He was wrong. The moment his left hand touched my shoulder, the terrified old man vanished. The illusion was completely dead. I moved with a sudden, explosive violence that defied my 74 years of age. I did not shrink away. I lunged forward. I grabbed his left wrist with my right hand, applying a brutal twisting torque that instantly locked his elbow joints. He let out a sharp gasp of surprise as his balance was completely destroyed. Before he could even process the pain, I brought my left arm up and struck the inside of his right forearm with a precise chopping blow. The sudden strike paralyzed his nerves. His fingers flew open involuntarily. The plastic syringe dropped from his grip. I caught the syringe out of the air before it hit the concrete floor. I pivoted my hips, driving my knee hard into his chest. The impact knocked the wind completely out of his lungs. He collapsed backward onto the damp concrete floor, landing heavily on his back. I moved over him instantly. I pinned his chest down with my knee, putting my entire body weight directly over his heart. Dr. Evans stared up at me, his face entirely paralyzed by shock and sudden absolute terror. He opened his mouth to scream for Terrence. I slammed my left hand over his mouth, silencing him completely. With my right hand, I brought the needle down and pressed the sharp metal tip directly against the pulsing skin of his carotid artery. If you make a single sound, I will empty this entire barrel of sedative directly into your bloodstream. I whispered, my voice dropping to a dark, lethal rumble. Your heart will stop beating before Terrence even finishes his phone call. Nod if you understand me. Dr. Evans stared at the needle pressing into his neck. He could feel the sharp prick of the metal against his skin. His eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated horror. He nodded his head frantically up and down. I slowly removed my hand from his mouth, but I kept the needle pressed firmly against his artery. He gasped for air, his chest heaving under my knee. "Who are you?" he stammered, tears of panic welling in the corners of his eyes. "Vincent cannot fight like this. You are not Vincent." I leaned down closer until my dirt-smeared face was just inches from his perfect silver hair. "My name is Victor Pierce," I whispered. "I am Vincent's twin brother. I am the man who built a real estate empire in Chicago by burying men far smarter and far more dangerous than a cowardly, corrupt doctor. And you just admitted to federal medical fraud, extortion, and conspiracy to commit elder abuse. His face drained of all remaining color. He looked like a corpse. Victor Pierce. He had undoubtedly heard the name. He knew Terrence's uncle was a ruthless billionaire who operated in the shadows. He suddenly realized he was not pinning a sheep to the floor. He was trapped under the jaws of a wolf. Please, Victor. Dr. Evans whimpered, his voice shaking uncontrollably. Please do not kill me. Terrence made me do it. He threatened me. Do not lie to me, I growled, pressing the needle just a fraction of a millimeter deeper into his skin. I read the offshore wire transfers last night. You sold my brother's life for luxury vacations. Now, you are going to give me exactly what I want, or you are never leaving this shed alive. I reached into the pocket of my filthy sweatpants with my free hand. I pulled out the microscopic recording device Malik had given me. I held it right next to his trembling mouth. You are going to speak into this device, I commanded, my tone absolutely chilling. You are going to state your full legal name and your medical license number. You are going to confess that Vincent Pierce never had dementia. You are going to detail exactly how much money Terrence and Andre paid you to falsify those medical records. You are going to name the offshore accounts. You are going to confess to the entire conspiracy right here, right now. I cannot do that, Dr. Evans sobbed, shaking his head. If I confess, I will lose my medical license. I will go to federal prison. I smiled, a cold, dead smile that made him freeze entirely. If you do not confess, I will inject this chemical into your neck and leave you to rot on this concrete floor. Prison is a far better alternative than a shallow grave in a suburban backyard. Choose your future, doctor. You have 3 seconds. He looked at the needle. He looked at my eyes. He saw absolutely zero mercy. The wealthy, arrogant doctor broke completely. He crumbled under the weight of his own cowardice. Okay, he wept, his body trembling beneath my knee. Okay, I will say whatever you want. Just take the needle away. Please take it away. I moved the needle back just a single inch, but kept it aimed directly at his throat. I held the recording device closer to his lips. Start talking, I ordered. For the next 5 minutes, the dark, foul-smelling shed became a confession booth. Dr. Evans wept and stammered through a complete, detailed admission of his crimes. He stated his medical license number. He admitted that Vincent was in perfect cognitive health when the guardianship was established. He detailed the exact payment schedule Terrence had arranged to keep the fake medical evaluations updated. He confessed to violating his medical oath and knowingly committing federal fraud. Every single word was captured flawlessly by the military-grade microphone in my hand. I had the absolute undeniable proof required to destroy the legal foundation of my nephew's control over my brother. The corrupt doctor had just handed me the keys to dismantle their entire operation. When he finished his confession, he lay on the floor gasping for breath, a broken, pathetic man stripped of all his arrogant authority. "What are you going to do with me now?" he whispered, crying softly. I took the syringe and carefully capped the needle, throwing it into the corner of the shed. I stood up and pocketed the recording device. I looked down at him with profound disgust. "You are going to stand up, brush off your expensive suit, and walk out of this shed," I told him, my voice cold and authoritative. "You are going to tell Terrence that the patient is fully sedated and completely unresponsive. You are going to get into your luxury car, and you are going to drive away. If you warn Terrence, if you try to run, or if you call the police, I will release this recording to the medical board and the Federal Bureau of Investigation before the sun goes down." He scrambled to his feet, brushing the dirt off his charcoal suit with shaking hands. He could not look me in the eye. He nodded his head rapidly, accepting the terms of his survival. "Now get out of my sight," I commanded, pointing toward the open wooden doors. Dr. Evans practically ran out of the shed, stumbling over his own expensive shoes. I watched through the crack in the door as he approached Terrence on the patio. He kept his head down, avoiding eye contact. He mumbled a few words to my nephew, grabbed his medical bag, and hurried down the driveway to his car. He looked like a man fleeing a burning building. Terrence watched him leave with a confused expression. Then he shrugged, pulled out his phone, and walked back inside the main house, entirely unaware that his legal shield had just been completely obliterated. I walked back to the moldy mattress and sat down in the dark. I touched the recording device in my pocket. The medical conspiracy was defeated. The financial trap with the criminal syndicate was already set in motion. The walls were closing in on Terrence and Andre rapidly, and they did not even feel the shadows moving. It was time to escalate the pressure. It was time to use the massive wealth I had accumulated in Chicago to become the ultimate architect of their destruction. It was time to become their biggest nightmare. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. I watched the corrupt doctor stumble down the driveway and flee in his luxury car, leaving me entirely alone in the foul-smelling shed. The medical conspiracy was completely dismantled. The legal shield Terrence and Andre had bought to protect their crimes was now nothing more than a recorded confession resting safely in my pocket. But a broken shield was not enough. I needed to control the very ground they walked on. I needed to own their entire future before they even realized their past was catching up to them. I pulled the microscopic cellular device from the pocket of my filthy sweatpants. It was no larger than a standard coat button, but it carried a direct encrypted signal to my corporate headquarters in Chicago. I pressed the small tactile ridge on the side, holding the device close to my mouth. "Crawford?" I said, keeping my voice low in the damp darkness of the shed. A crisp, professional voice answered immediately through the tiny earpiece Malik had given me. "I am here, Mr. Pierce. We have been waiting for your signal." Crawford was my chief legal counsel and the primary architect of my most aggressive corporate takeovers. He commanded an army of financial analysts, ruthless litigators, and proxy investors. He did not know why I was sitting in a rotting shed in a wealthy Atlanta suburb, but he knew better than to ask questions. When I gave an order, he executed it with lethal precision. "I need you to locate a specific underground lending entity operating out of Atlanta," I instructed, staring at the rotting wooden walls. "They operate under a series of ghost shell companies. I scanned their contract earlier today. They just issued a highly toxic $5 million cross-collateralized loan to Terrence and Andre Pierce." "My nephews." "Understood," Mr. Pierce Crawford replied, his keyboard clacking rapidly in the background. "What is the objective?" "I want to own that debt." "Crawford," I said, a cold, hard smile creeping across my dirt-smeared face. "I want you to trace the paper back to the primary syndicate bosses. Offer them a buyout they cannot possibly refuse. Pay them a 20% premium on the principal in pure liquid cash right now. Buy the paper, buy the collateral rights, and transfer the entire debt portfolio into a blind trust, completely controlled by me." There was a brief pause on the line as Crawford processed the magnitude of the request. "You want to buy out a violent criminal syndicate using a shadow corporation?" he clarified, confirming the parameters. "Exactly," I replied. "These underground syndicates only care about immediate liquidity. If we offer them a guaranteed instant profit without the hassle of collecting on a highly risky loan, they will sell the paper instantly. They do not care who holds the leash as long as they get paid. It will be done within the hour," Mr. Pierce Crawford stated with absolute confidence. "They will not even know who bought it. I will use our dummy corporations in Delaware to mask the transaction completely." "Do it," I commanded. "And Crawford, make sure you secure the original collateral agreement, the one containing the forged signature." I ended the call and slipped the device back into my pocket. I leaned my head against the cold concrete wall and closed my eyes. My nephews thought they were so incredibly clever. They thought they had outsmarted their helpless father and successfully scammed a violent criminal enterprise. They believed they were going to take the $5 million, launder it through their fake startup, and flee to Monaco. They planned to leave a senile old man locked in a psychiatric ward to face the wrath of the underground mob when the payments inevitably stopped. They did not know that the violent criminal enterprise was no longer their creditor. I was their creditor. I owned their $5 million debt. I officially owned their entire pathetic future. If they tried to run, I would freeze their assets legally as their primary lien holder. If they stayed, I would crush them under the impossible weight of their own fraudulent obligations. I was the phantom creditor hiding in their own backyard, and they were dancing directly on my strings without even feeling the tug. I spent the afternoon sitting on the moldy mattress listening to the sounds of the main house. I heard Chloe laughing loudly on the pristine stone patio. I heard the distinct clinking of expensive wine glasses. They were celebrating their impending wealth. They were drinking to the success of their ultimate betrayal. I let them celebrate. I wanted them to feel victorious. The higher they allowed themselves to fly, the more devastating the physical and psychological impact would be when I finally dragged them down to the concrete. As the sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the damp floor of the shed, my earpiece vibrated softly. "The acquisition is complete," Mr. Pierce Crawford reported, his voice a model of cold, absolute efficiency. "We paid a heavy premium, but the syndicate officially transferred the debt without asking a single question. You are now the sole holder of the $5 million shark loan. We also hold the fraudulent collateral deed bearing your signature. The financial trap is fully armed and active." "Excellent work, Crawford," I replied. "Stand by for the liquidation phase. I will contact you when it is time to drop the hammer." The communication channel clicked over. A new voice filled my earpiece. It was Malik. My head of security had been standing guard at the private medical facility downtown where my brother Vincent was being treated, Boss Malik said. His voice was not cold or professional. It was heavy. It was thick with a dark, suppressed anger that a veteran police detective rarely lets show. "The chief of medicine just brought me the preliminary diagnostic report on your brother."
"Read it to me, Malik," I commanded, bracing myself for the reality of what my nephews had done to my twin.
There was a long, agonizing pause on the line. Malik took a deep, shaky breath. "It is bad," Boss Malik continued, his voice tight with absolute rage. "It is much worse than we thought when we pulled him out of there. Vincent is suffering from severe late-stage malnutrition. His body has been consuming its own muscle tissue just to keep his vital organs functioning. He has acute scurvy from a total lack of basic vitamins. His bone density is critically compromised." "Tell me everything, Malik," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous, violent rumble. "They never let him out of that shed." Boss Malik said, the disgust evident in every syllable. "He has deep necrotic bed sores along his spine and hips from sleeping on that damp mattress for years. The sores are severely infected. The infection has entered his bloodstream. He is actively fighting sepsis. The doctor said his immune system is completely destroyed. If we had not pulled him out of that shed last night, his heart would have given out within the week. He would have died in the dark, entirely alone and in excruciating pain." I sat in the pitch-black shed. The earpiece went silent. I reached up and touched the filthy, mold-infested mattress beneath me. I felt the freezing, damp concrete walls. I breathed in the foul, suffocating stench of rotting wood and stale urine. I let the reality of this physical space wash over me completely. My twin brother, the gentle accountant who had never harmed a single soul in his entire life. He had spent 6 years wasting away in this miserable box. He had starved in the freezing cold while his own sons drank expensive wine and wore designer clothes just 50 feet away. They had walked past this shed every single day. They had listened to him whimper. They had watched him slowly die of infection and starvation, and they had laughed about it. They had treated his slow, agonizing death as a convenient administrative process. The calculated strategic mindset of a corporate real estate tycoon completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a primal biblical fury. The ice water in my veins turned to boiling acid. I did not just want to seize their money anymore. I did not just want to send them to a federal penitentiary. Prison was a country club compared to what they had done to my brother. Prison was a sanctuary with 3 warm meals a day and a clean bed. I was not going to give them a sanctuary. I was not going to let them hide behind the structured safety of the legal system. I was going to rip away every single thing that made them feel human. I was going to tear down their arrogance, their stolen wealth, their fake luxury, and their pathetic pride. I was going to make them feel the exact same helpless, suffocating terror they had forced my brother to endure for 6 agonizing years. I was going to burn them until there was nothing left but ash and regret. I reached into my pocket and gripped the small communication button, squeezing it so hard my knuckles popped. "Malik," I said, my voice completely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. "I am here," Boss Malik answered instantly, recognizing the lethal shift in my tone. "Tell the doctors to save my brother's life, no matter the cost," I ordered, staring into the black void of the shed. "And then assemble the tactical team. Call in every single favor we have in this city. Tell Crawford to prepare the destruction protocols. We are not just turning them over to the police anymore, Malik. We are going to orchestrate a complete and total annihilation. I want them broken. I want them begging. I want them to wish they had never been born. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. The sun dipped below the tree line and the sprawling backyard transformed into a playground for the wicked. String lights illuminated the pristine lawn. I sat in the pitch-black shed listening to the heavy bass of electronic music thumping through the wooden walls. The smell of expensive catered food drifted through the cracks in the rotting wood. Roasted meats and rich spices mocked the stale stench of urine and decay inside my concrete cell. Terrence and Chloe were hosting a lavish dinner party. They were celebrating their impending wealth. They were drinking expensive champagne to toast the $5 million they believed was currently processing into their bank accounts. They were celebrating the final destruction of the man who gave them life. I remained seated on the moldy mattress in the dark. My knees were pulled tight against my chest. The contrast was absolutely poetic. Less than 20 meters away from my wooden cage, a group of parasites danced and laughed on property bought with my brother's blood. They had no idea they were celebrating inside a graveyard of their own making. Hours passed, the music grew louder and the voices grew sloppy. Alcohol removes the filter of caution. It makes arrogant people loud and careless. I heard a group of heavy footsteps stumbling across the manicured grass. They were heading directly toward the shed. I heard Terrence laughing, his voice thick and slurred with expensive bourbon. "Come over here, guys," Terrence shouted to his friends. "You have to see the storage unit. It is where I keep all my antique garbage." A chorus of drunken laughter followed him. I quickly lay down on the damp concrete floor. I curled into a tight fetal position, shielding my face with my dirty arms. I let my body tremble violently. The heavy steel padlock rattled and the wooden doors were thrown wide open. The sudden blast of bright light from the backyard flooded the dark shed. I squinted through my fingers. Terrence stood in the doorway, surrounded by 3 other men dressed in tailored suits. They were all holding crystal glasses filled with dark amber liquor. Chloe stood right behind them, resting her head on Terrence's shoulder and giggling uncontrollably. "Look at it," Terrence sneered, pointing his glass directly at me. The great Vincent Pierce, the man who thought he could control me forever. Now he sleeps on a moldy dog bed and eats whatever leftovers we throw at him. His friends leaned in, peering into the dark shed like tourists looking at a pathetic animal in a zoo. They did not show an ounce of human empathy. They did not see a starving, sick old man. They saw a joke. They saw a prop for Terrence's arrogant stand-up routine. "Man, that smell is absolutely revolting," one of the friends said, covering his nose with a silk handkerchief. "How do you even stand having that thing in your backyard, Terrence?" "I do not have to stand it for much longer." Terrence laughed, taking a long sip of his drink. "The transport van comes on Monday morning. I bought a doctor to sign the dementia papers. They are going to drag him off to the state asylum and lock him in a padded room. He is going to spend the rest of his life staring at a white wall while I spend his millions on the French Riviera." The sheer brazen stupidity of his confession was staggering. He was bragging about federal crimes to his drinking buddies. He was so drunk on his own perceived power that he felt completely invincible. Another friend, a tall man with a slicked-back haircut, took a step closer to the doorway. He looked down at me with pure malicious amusement. "Hey, old man!" the friend shouted, kicking the wooden doorframe. "Wake up! Your son is talking about you." I let out a weak, pathetic whimper. I pressed my face closer to the concrete floor, pretending to be absolutely terrified of them. The slick-haired friend laughed loudly. He raised his crystal glass filled with red wine. He did not even hesitate. He forcefully threw the glass directly at me. The heavy crystal shattered against the concrete wall just inches above my head. Shards of sharp glass rained down on my back. The dark red wine splashed across my filthy sweatpants and pooled on the floor, looking exactly like fresh blood in the dim light. "Oops," the friend chuckled mockingly. "I guess I spilled my drink." "You better clean that up, old man, before it stains your beautiful home." The entire group erupted into cruel, uproarious laughter. Terrence slapped his friend on the back, completely endorsing the physical assault on his own father. Chloe giggled louder, pulling Terrence away from the door. "Come on, guys," Chloe said, pulling his arm. "The smell is ruining my appetite. Let us go back to the patio and open another bottle of champagne." "The old man is not worth our time," Terrence nodded, tossing his empty glass onto the grass. "You are right, babe. We have millions to spend. Let him rot in the dark." They pulled the wooden doors shut. The heavy steel padlock clicked into place. The shed was plunged back into total darkness. Their laughter faded as they walked back toward the music and the bright lights of the party. I stayed on the floor for exactly 10 seconds, listening to make sure they were gone. Then I stopped trembling. I sat up perfectly straight in the pitch-black darkness. I brushed the sharp shards of broken crystal off my shoulders. I looked at the puddle of red wine soaking into the dirt. I reached into the pocket of my filthy sweatpants and pulled out my hand. I was not cowering in fear when they opened those doors. I was not hiding my face to protect myself. I was holding the microscopic cellular device Malik had given me. I had held it perfectly steady between my crossed arms, aiming the high-definition camera lens directly at the doorway. I had just recorded every single second of their interaction. I captured the faces of the friends who assaulted me. I captured Chloe laughing at my misery. And most importantly, I captured Terrence delivering a clear, undeniable audio and video confession of his entire criminal enterprise. I captured him bragging about bribing a medical professional, forging dementia papers, and planning to steal millions of dollars. He had just handed me the final nail for his own coffin. I pressed a single button on the device, transmitting the encrypted video file directly to my legal team in Chicago. The evidence was instantly secured on multiple offshore servers. Even if they burned the shed to the ground with me inside it, the evidence would survive and destroy them. I sat on the moldy mattress and waited. The music from the party continued for another 2 hours. The loud voices gradually turned into sleepy murmurs as the guests began to leave. I heard car doors slamming in the driveway. I heard the engines starting and fading away into the night. Finally, the music stopped entirely. The heavy silence of the affluent suburb returned. I assumed Terrence and Chloe had gone inside to sleep off their expensive alcohol. I stood up and stretched my legs, preparing to endure the rest of the cold night. But then I heard a new sound. It was the slow, deliberate crunch of gravel and grass. Someone was walking toward the shed. The footsteps were not stumbling or drunk. They were slow, measured, and incredibly focused. I moved silently to the wooden doors and pressed my eye against a thin crack in the rotting wood. It was Andre, the younger brother. He had stayed behind to clean up the backyard or perhaps to check the perimeter. He walked up to the shed and stopped. He stood perfectly still, staring at the wooden doors. He did not look like Terrence. He did not look drunk or arrogant. He looked intensely paranoid. Andre was the anxious one. He was the one who worried about the syndicate and the missing funds. I watched through the crack as Andre reached out and grabbed the heavy steel padlock. He lifted it up, holding it close to his face under the pale moonlight. He turned the metal lock over in his hands. My blood ran completely cold. When I broke out of the shed last night, I used a rusted iron bar to pry the original lock off the door frame. Malik had replaced it with an identical lock when I returned, but I had left deep, aggressive gouge marks in the rotting wood of the doorframe. The metal latch plate was slightly bent, and the surrounding wood was splintered and scarred from the sheer violent force I had applied. Andre was staring directly at those fresh, splintered gouge marks. He rubbed his thumb over the raw, exposed wood. He knew exactly what he was looking at. A frail, starving old man dying of malnutrition could never generate enough physical force to tear a steel latch plate out of a wooden frame. Someone had broken into the shed from the outside. Or someone had broken out. Andre dropped the padlock. It hit the wooden door with a dull thud. His entire body tensed. He took a slow step backward, creating distance between himself and the shed doors. He looked around the dark backyard, his eyes scanning the shadows for a threat. Then he reached his right hand inside his tailored jacket. He pulled out a sleek black handgun. The moonlight glinted off the metal barrel. It was a compact, semi-automatic pistol. Andre held it firmly in his right hand, keeping his finger off the trigger but resting it aggressively along the slide. He reached his left hand up and racked the slide back with a sharp metallic clack, chambering a live round. He raised the weapon, pointing the barrel directly at the center of the wooden doors. He aimed it exactly at chest height. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. He reached his left hand out toward the padlock, preparing to open the door and confront whatever was hiding inside the dark box. I stood completely still on the other side of the thin wooden door. I did not breathe. I did not blink. Andre was terrified, and a terrified man with a loaded gun is the most dangerous variable in any tactical situation. If he opened that door and saw me standing tall instead of cowering on the floor, he would pull the trigger out of pure reflex. I lowered my center of gravity, bending my knees and shifting my weight onto the balls of my feet. I balled my hands into tight, rock-hard fists. I was unarmed. I was locked inside a concrete box. I had exactly 1 second to disarm him if he pulled that door open. Andre gripped the padlock. The metal key jingled in his trembling hand. He slid the key into the slot. The hunt had suddenly shifted. The sheep was gone. The wolves were finally meeting face to face in the dark. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. I stood in the pitch-black shed listening to the metallic scraping of the key sliding into the heavy steel padlock. My muscles were coiled and ready to explode. I shifted my weight onto the balls of my bare, dirty feet. If Andre pulled the wooden doors open and raised his weapon, I would have to disarm him immediately. A panicked man with a loaded firearm is unpredictable. I calculated the distance between the doorframe and my position. It was exactly 3 steps. I could cross that distance in less than a second. I prepared to strike his wrist and shatter his radius bone before his finger could even twitch against the trigger. But then the scraping sound stopped. Andre paused. I could hear his rapid, shallow breathing through the thin wooden planks. He was hesitating. The alcohol from the dinner party was likely wearing off, leaving him with nothing but raw, gnawing paranoia. The damaged wood around the latch plate had spooked him deeply. He turned the key. The padlock clicked and popped open with a heavy metallic thud. I made a split-second tactical decision. If I attacked him and took the gun, the timeline would accelerate uncontrollably. The police would be called. The syndicate trap would be disrupted. I needed to maintain the psychological high ground without compromising the ultimate financial slaughter. I stepped back from the door. I moved to the far corner of the damp concrete floor. I did not curl into a pathetic trembling ball. I did not hide my face. Instead, I sat down, crossing my legs into a disciplined, meditative posture. I rested my hands loosely on my knees. I slowed my heart rate down to a steady, calm rhythm. I waited in the absolute darkness. The heavy wooden doors creaked open. A pale shaft of cold moonlight cut through the darkness of the shed, illuminating the floating dust particles in the air. Andre stepped into the doorway. His tailored linen suit was slightly wrinkled from the party. His face was pale and slick with a thin layer of nervous sweat. In his right hand he held the compact, semi-automatic pistol, aiming it directly at the center of the room. His left hand gripped the edge of the wooden door tightly. He swept the barrel of the gun across the small space. The moonlight eventually found me sitting completely motionless in the far corner. Andre stopped moving. He stared at me. His chest heaved up and down. He was expecting to see a broken, frail old man whimpering on a moldy mattress. He was expecting his father to beg for mercy at the sight of the gun. He was not expecting a statue carved from dark stone sitting in perfect, absolute silence. "What did you do to the door, old man?" Andre demanded, his voice tight and shaking. His tone lacked the arrogant confidence his brother Terence always displayed. Andre was a coward, pretending to be a criminal. "Answer me right now," he ordered, taking a hesitant step into the foul-smelling shed. "How did the wood around the lock get splintered? Did you try to break out?" I did not answer him. I did not move a single muscle. I kept my breathing so shallow and slow that my chest barely appeared to rise. I stared at the concrete floor just a few inches in front of his expensive leather shoes. Andre gritted his teeth. His paranoia was quickly mutating into aggressive frustration. He felt foolish for being afraid of a starving 74-year-old man. He needed to reassert his dominance to prove to himself that he was still the predator in the room. He took another step forward, closing the distance between us. He raised his left hand, curling it into a fist while keeping the gun leveled at my chest with his right hand. "I am talking to you, parasite," Andre snarled, leaning down slightly. "You think you can ignore me. You think you can damage my property. I will beat you until you cannot even remember your own name." He pulled his left arm back, preparing to strike me across the face to teach me a lesson in obedience. That was the exact moment I decided to drop the disguise entirely. I did not need to use my fists to break Andre. I only needed to use my mind. I slowly raised my head. I lifted my chin and looked up. I locked my eyes directly onto his. I did not give him the confused, terrified look of Vincent Pierce. I gave him the cold, dead stare of Victor Pierce. It was the exact same stare I used across mahogany boardroom tables when I systematically destroyed rival developers. It was the gaze of a man who had orchestrated the ruin of powerful politicians and ruthless union bosses. It was the eyes of an apex predator looking at a very small, very weak piece of meat. I stripped away every ounce of human warmth, empathy, and fear from my expression. I let the absolute dark void of my soul rise to the surface. I looked at him as if he were already a corpse rotting in the dirt. Andre stopped mid-strike. His left fist hovered uselessly in the air. The breath caught in his throat with a sharp, audible gasp. He looked into my eyes, and his primal instincts overrode his conscious mind entirely. Human beings are animals at their core. We possess an ancient biological warning system designed to recognize when we are standing in the presence of a superior lethal threat. Andre's warning system triggered a massive catastrophic alarm in his nervous system. The hair on the back of his neck stood straight up. His pupils dilated in pure, unadulterated terror. He felt the heavy, crushing weight of my presence. He realized in a fraction of a second that the entity sitting on the damp concrete floor was not a victim. It was a monster. It was a force of nature that was quietly, patiently waiting to consume him whole. Andre tried to speak, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. His jaw trembled. He looked at the gun in his right hand, and then he looked back at my face. He had a loaded weapon aimed directly at my heart, but his brain calculated that pulling the trigger would be a fatal mistake. He felt a profound, chilling certainty that if he fired that weapon, the bullet would simply bounce off me, and I would tear him apart with my bare hands. I did not break eye contact. I did not blink. I stared right through his skull and into the empty, cowardly center of his being. I let a slow, dark, and entirely humorless smile curve the corners of my dirt-smeared lips. The smile broke him completely. Andre stumbled backward. His expensive leather shoes slipped on the damp concrete, causing him to lose his balance entirely. He caught himself on the wooden door frame, scrambling frantically to get out of the shed. He was panting like a hunted animal. He pulled the gun back, pressing it tight against his own chest, as if trying to protect himself from the invisible, crushing pressure radiating from my corner of the room. He tripped over the metal track of the sliding door, backing out onto the lawn. He grabbed the heavy wooden doors and slammed them shut with a loud, violent crash. I heard the metal padlock scrape frantically against the latch. He fumbled with the key, his hands shaking so violently he could barely secure the lock. The padlock finally clicked into place. I remained sitting in the dark, my smile fading back into a cold, flat line. The physical threat was gone, but the psychological damage I had just inflicted on him was permanent. I had planted a seed of absolute terror in his mind. He would never sleep peacefully in that house again. I stood up and walked silently to the wooden door, pressing my ear against the rotting planks. I could hear Andre sprinting across the manicured grass. He was not walking. He was running for his life toward the back patio of the main house. I heard the sliding glass door rip open and slam shut. I reached into the pocket of my filthy sweatpants and pulled out the small encrypted communication button Malik had given me. The device also functioned as a highly sensitive directional audio receiver. I pressed it against the wooden door, turning the volume dial to maximum. The device filtered out the ambient noise of the wind and focused directly on the sound frequencies bouncing off the glass windows of the main house. I could hear the muffled, frantic voices inside the living room. Andre had woken Terrence up. "Terrence, you have to listen to me." Andre was shouting, his voice echoing faintly through my receiver. His tone was hysterical, completely stripped of its usual arrogant calm. "Something is wrong. Something is very wrong with the old man out there." "What are you talking about?" Andre Terrence replied, his voice thick with sleep and severe irritation. "It is 3 a.m. Put the gun away before you shoot a hole in my television. Are you drunk?" "I am not drunk." Terrence Andre panicked, pacing rapidly across the marble floor. I went out to check the shed. The lock frame was completely destroyed. Someone pried it open, and when I looked inside, he was just sitting there. He was not crying. He was not shaking. He looked at me, Terrence. He looked at me like he was going to kill me. It was not his face. It was not our father. I swear to God, there is a demon sitting in that shed. Terrence let out a loud, heavy sigh of profound disbelief. "You are losing your mind, Andre. The stress of the syndicate deal is making you hallucinate. He is a 74-year-old man dying of malnutrition. He weighs 100 pounds. He cannot even stand up without coughing. How could he possibly break a steel padlock? The wood is just rotting. It broke because it is old. I am telling you, he is dangerous, Terrence." Andre pleaded, his voice cracking with genuine fear. "We cannot wait until next week. We cannot leave him in the backyard for another 3 days. If he gets out, he is going to murder us in our sleep." There was a long silence in the living room. Terrence was weighing the situation. He did not believe his brother had seen a monster, but he recognized the severe liability of Andre's panic. If Andre lost his nerve, he might compromise the $5 million wire transfer. Terrence needed his younger brother focused and calm. "Fine. Terrence finally said, his voice cold and decisive. If it will make you stop crying like a child, we will move the timeline up. I am not waiting around for you to have a nervous breakdown and ruin the escrow clearance. The state transport van was supposed to arrive next Friday. I will call the corrupt dispatch officer first thing in the morning. I will pay him an extra $10,000 in cash to expedite the pickup. When Andre asked, his voice still trembling. Monday morning, Terrence confirmed firmly. The van will be here bright and early on Monday morning. They will put him in a chemical straitjacket and haul him off to the maximum security ward at the state asylum. He will be completely heavily sedated before he even leaves the driveway. By noon on Monday, he will be a permanent ward of the state, and we will never have to look at his face again. Do you feel better now? Yes, Andre exhaled heavily. Monday morning. We just have to survive until Monday morning. Good, Terrence snapped. Now go to bed and put that damn gun in the safe. I lowered the audio receiver from the door. I turned the device off and slipped it back into my pocket. I walked back to the center of the shed and stood in the absolute darkness. Terrence had just accelerated the timeline exactly as I had anticipated. By moving the transport date to Monday morning, he was compressing the operational window. He thought he was solving a problem by rushing his father off to an asylum. He thought he was securing his $5 million payday and eliminating his only remaining liability. He did not realize that accelerating the timeline was exactly what I wanted him to do. The syndicate debt was already purchased. The corrupt doctor had already confessed. The video evidence of their physical abuse was already secured on offshore servers. The pieces of the trap were completely set in place. I had Sunday to let them burn in their own paranoia. And on Monday morning, when the state transport van arrived to take a broken old man to a psychiatric prison, they were going to get the shock of their miserable lives. Monday morning was not going to be their escape. Monday morning was going to be their execution. The phantom creditor was preparing to step out of the shadows. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. Sunday morning arrived with a heavy silence over the affluent Atlanta suburb. I remained locked inside the dark, damp shed. I sat on the moldy mattress listening to the main house. Today was the day Terrence and Andre believed they were finalizing their massive $5 million real estate deal. They believed they were selling my brother's prime commercial property to a legitimate development company. They had absolutely no idea that the development company was a hollow shell corporation entirely owned and operated by my legal team in Chicago. I had orchestrated every single detail of this transaction from the shadows. I heard the heavy wooden front door of the main house open and close. I heard the expensive engines of their luxury vehicles start up and roar down the driveway. Terrence and Andre were heading downtown. They were dressed in their finest tailored suits, ready to play the role of successful businessmen. They were driving directly into the jaws of a federal financial trap. Miles away in a sleek glass office building in downtown Atlanta, my proxy was waiting for them. His name was Harrison. He was one of Crawford's most ruthless corporate attorneys. Harrison sat at the head of a massive mahogany conference table. He wore a suit that cost more than Terrence's entire car. When my nephews walked into the conference room, they were immediately intimidated by the display of absolute wealth and power. Harrison did not smile. He did not offer them coffee. He simply pointed to the leather chairs opposite him. Terrence and Andre sat down, opening their leather briefcases with nervous, trembling hands. They were desperate for the cash. The underground criminal syndicate they had borrowed money from was expecting their collateral guarantee today. If the money did not clear, the mob would come looking for blood. Terrence needed the $5 million to drop into his account immediately so he could launder it through his fake startup company and flee the country. Harrison slid a thick stack of legal documents across the polished table. He explained that the purchasing company was an international conglomerate based offshore. He told them the standard escrow process for a commercial plot of this magnitude usually took 30 days to clear domestic banking regulations. Terrence panicked immediately. He leaned forward, sweating profusely. He told Harrison they could not wait 30 days. He demanded the funds be released today. He claimed they had an urgent investment opportunity that required immediate liquid capital. This was exactly what Harrison was trained to anticipate. Greed makes criminals incredibly impatient and incredibly stupid. Harrison leaned back in his leather chair, tapping his expensive pen against the table. He told Terrence there was one alternative method to expedite the payment process today. Harrison explained that they could bypass the 30-day domestic escrow period by utilizing a direct international wire transfer from the conglomerate's offshore holding accounts. The money would hit Terrence's bank account by the end of the day. But to authorize an expedited international wire of $5 million, the federal banking system required absolute proof of collateral. Harrison demanded the original physical guarantee document signed by the primary owner of the land. He demanded the paper bearing the signature of Vincent Pierce. Terrence and Andre exchanged a look of pure, desperate relief. They thought this was their ultimate salvation. They thought they had outsmarted the system. Andre eagerly reached into his leather briefcase. He pulled out the thick legal document he had forced me to sign in the shed just yesterday. He slid the document across the mahogany table, handing it directly to Harrison. Andre and Terrence did not look at the ink on the page. They did not verify the signature. They were too blinded by the promise of instant millions to notice their own fatal mistake. Harrison picked up the document. He looked at the bottom of the final page. He saw the sharp, aggressive angles and the complex hooks of the signature. He saw the name Victor Pierce written clearly in dark blue ink. Harrison knew exactly what that signature meant. It meant the trap was fully armed. It meant my nephews had just handed over a forged legal document to facilitate a massive international financial transaction. Harrison kept his face completely blank. He nodded slowly and placed the document into a digital scanner on the table. He pressed a button transmitting the high-resolution scan directly to the federal banking portal. He told Terrence and Andre that the wire transfer was officially initiated. He shook their hands and dismissed them from the office. Terrence and Andre walked out of the glass building feeling like absolute kings. They drove back to the suburban house blasting loud music in their luxury cars. They thought they had won. They thought they were rich. I sat in the dark shed listening to them return. They parked their cars and walked into the house laughing loudly. Chloe greeted them at the door asking if they should start packing their designer luggage for the flight to Monaco. Terrence told her to pack the best clothes because they were officially multimillionaires. They celebrated in the living room for exactly 2 hours. They drank champagne and talked about the boats they were going to buy. Then the music suddenly stopped. I pressed my encrypted communication device against the rotting wooden door of the shed. I turned the audio receiver up to maximum volume. I listened intently to the chaos unfolding inside the main house. Terrence's phone had chimed with a high-priority email notification. It was not a message from a wealth management advisor. It was an automated security alert from the Federal Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. I heard Terrence gasp loudly. I heard the sound of a crystal champagne glass slipping from his hand and shattering against the marble floor. "What is wrong, Terrence?" Chloe asked, her voice laced with sudden panic. Terrence could barely speak. His voice trembled violently as he read the words on his phone screen. "The transfer," he whispered. "The $5 million transfer is frozen. The bank did not release the funds." Andre yelled in absolute terror. "What do you mean it is frozen, Terrence? The syndicate needs their guarantee today. If the money is frozen, we are dead. Call the broker right now. Call Harrison." Terrence dialed the phone with shaking fingers. He put the call on speakerphone. The line rang twice before a cold, automated banking representative answered. Terrence frantically demanded to know why his international wire transfer was completely locked. He yelled that he had provided all the necessary legal documentation. The automated voice was replaced by a live federal compliance officer. The officer informed Terrence that the transaction had triggered a severe federal fraud alert. The system had detected a catastrophic discrepancy in the legal documentation provided. The collateral guarantee submitted to secure the $5 million offshore transfer did not bear the signature of the registered property owner Vincent Pierce. The federal officer stated clearly that the document bore the legally registered signature of a completely different individual named Victor Pierce. Furthermore, the destination account for the funds was flagged as a suspected laundering front for a known violent criminal syndicate. I listened through my earpiece as the reality of the situation crashed down on my nephews. They had submitted a fraudulent signature on a federal banking portal to move money for the mob. They had officially committed international wire fraud and criminal racketeering in a single catastrophic move. The federal compliance officer delivered the final, devastating blow. The officer informed Terrence that the entire $5 million sum was seized and placed into a secure federal holding account pending a full criminal investigation. The bank was legally obligated to report the fraudulent activity to the Federal Bureau of Investigation immediately. Terrence and Andre were given an official ultimatum. The officer told them they had exactly 48 hours to physically present themselves at the federal banking headquarters with the true owner of the property to verify his identity and explain the fraudulent signature. If they failed to appear within 48 hours, the bank would issue federal arrest warrants for both of them. The phone call disconnected, leaving a dial tone echoing through the silent living room. Andre began to hyperventilate. His breaths came in short, rapid gasps. He paced across the living room, tearing at his own hair. He screamed that they were going to federal prison. He screamed that the syndicate was going to murder them before the federal agents even arrived. He blamed Terrence for not checking the signature on the document. Terrence stood completely paralyzed. The arrogant venture capitalist persona evaporated instantly. He stared at his phone, unable to comprehend how his perfect crime had collapsed into a federal nightmare. He realized that the old man in the shed had not signed his own name. He realized they had been played. "We have 48 hours," Andre cried hysterically. "We have to run Terrence. We have to pack the bags and drive to the border right now. We cannot run, you idiot." Terrence shouted back, his voice cracking with pure terror. "Our passports will be flagged by midnight. Our accounts are completely frozen. We do not have a single dollar of clean money to buy a plane ticket. We are trapped in this house." Chloe began to sob loudly, mourning the loss of her stolen luxury lifestyle. She realized she was not going to Monaco. She was going to be an accessory to a massive federal crime. "The only way out is the 48-hour window," Terrence said, trying desperately to regain control of his breathing. "The bank said we have to bring the old man down there to verify his identity. We have to force him to tell the federal agents he signed the wrong name by mistake because of his dementia. We have to make him take the fall for the fraud." Andre laughed a manic, terrified sound. "Bring him to the federal bank, Terrence. Look at him. He is starving to death in a shed. He is covered in dirt and his mind is completely gone. If we walk into a federal building with him looking like a tortured prisoner, they will arrest us for elder abuse on the exact same day. Then we clean him up," Terrence ordered, his voice completely ruthless. "We wash him. We put him in a suit. We drug him just enough to keep him quiet, but awake. We walk him into that bank, and we force him to lie to the federal agents. It is our only chance to unfreeze the money and escape the country." I lowered the audio receiver from the wooden door. I smiled in the pitch-black darkness of the shed. My nephews were scrambling like rats on a sinking ship. They thought they could still manipulate their way out of a federal trap. They thought they could clean me up and force me to lie for them. They did not know that the trap was impenetrable. They did not know that I was the phantom creditor pulling the strings. They were terrified of the 48-hour deadline, but they had forgotten about their own accelerated timeline. The state psychiatric transport van was still scheduled to arrive tomorrow morning. Monday morning was approaching fast. The pieces were colliding perfectly. The end was rapidly approaching, and they had nowhere left to hide. I sat down on the moldy mattress and closed my eyes. I rested my head against the cold concrete wall, waiting for the sun to rise. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. Sunday evening descended upon the affluent Atlanta suburb with a bitter, unforgiving chill. Winter nights in the South can be deceptive, but tonight the temperature was plummeting rapidly toward freezing. Inside the main house, the atmosphere had completely deteriorated from a luxurious celebration into a panicked, vicious war zone. Terrence and Andre were locked in the study, screaming at each other, trying to figure out how to unfreeze the $5 million before the federal authorities arrived. But Chloe had a different method of coping with the catastrophic loss of her stolen wealth. She needed someone to punish. She needed a physical target for her profound, raging entitlement. I sat on the moldy mattress in the pitch-black shed, listening to the sharp, aggressive clicking of her high heels marching across the frozen grass. She was not bringing me food. She was bringing her absolute fury. The heavy steel padlock rattled violently. Chloe threw the wooden doors open. The biting winter wind rushed into the shed, carrying the scent of frost and dead leaves. Chloe stood in the doorway, holding a thick, heavy flashlight. The bright beam hit my face, blinding me instantly. I raised my dirty arms, pretending to cower in fear. "This is all your fault, you worthless parasite!" Chloe screamed, her voice echoing across the dark yard. She was hysterical. Her perfect makeup was smeared, and her designer clothes looked disheveled. "You did this on purpose. You signed the wrong name just to ruin my life. We were supposed to be packing for Monaco tonight. Now my bank cards are declining and my husband is terrified of going to federal prison." I whimpered softly, retreating deeper into the corner of the concrete floor. "Please, Chloe," I stammered, acting completely confused. "I do not know what Monaco is. I just want a blanket. It is so cold in here." "You want a blanket?" Chloe sneered, stepping forward and kicking my leg with her sharp heel. "You do not deserve a blanket. You do not deserve anything. You are the reason we are trapped in this nightmare. Terrence says we have to clean you up tomorrow and parade you into a bank. He says we have to keep you alive. But I am not going to let you sleep comfortably tonight while my entire future falls apart." She looked up at the ceiling of the shed. There was a single exposed wire running from the main house to a small pathetic space heater tucked into the corner of the shed. It was the only thing keeping the ambient temperature inside the wooden box slightly above freezing. Chloe marched over to the space heater. She did not just unplug it. She raised her expensive high heel and stomped down brutally on the plastic casing. The heater cracked and splintered under her weight. Then she reached up, grabbed the power cord, and ripped it violently from the wall socket. Sparks flew into the dark air as the wire snapped and fell to the concrete. There, Chloe hissed her breath, highly visible in the freezing air. "No more heat for the parasite. Let us see how smart you feel when you are freezing to death in the dark. Maybe the cold will fix your broken brain by tomorrow morning." She turned around and stormed out of the shed. She slammed the heavy wooden doors shut. The steel padlock clicked into place, sealing me inside the freezing concrete box. The temperature inside the shed began to drop immediately. The thin wooden walls provided absolutely zero insulation against the biting winter wind. The damp concrete floor turned into a block of solid ice beneath me. I was wearing nothing but a tattered shirt and thin, filthy sweatpants. A normal 74-year-old man in my brother Vincent's condition would have succumbed to hypothermia within a few short hours. They knew this. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She was not just punishing an old man. She was actively executing a premeditated murder out of pure spite and sheer frustration. I waited until her footsteps faded completely across the frozen grass. I stopped trembling. I sat up straight in the pitch-black darkness. The cold was agonizing. It pierced through my thin clothing and bit deep into my muscles. But I welcomed the pain. I used the freezing air to sharpen my focus. I reached under the corner of the moldy mattress where Malik had hidden a small waterproof supply pouch during our initial midnight switch. I unzipped the pouch and pulled out two specific devices. The first was a highly calibrated digital thermometer. The second was a military-grade infrared micro camera. When I activated the digital thermometer, the screen lit up with a harsh green glow, casting an eerie light against the dark wooden planks. I watched the digital numbers fall rapidly. It dropped from 40 degrees to 30 degrees in a matter of minutes. As the wind picked up outside, whistling through the cracks, the temperature plummeted further, reading 25 degrees. This was a lethal environment for anyone, but for a malnourished senior citizen, it was an absolute death sentence. I turned on the military-grade infrared microcamera. I pointed the lens toward the ceiling, capturing the severed wire that Chloe had violently ripped from the electrical socket. The thermal imaging screen displayed the entire shed in stark, unyielding shades of dark blue and purple. There was no heat source anywhere. I turned the camera, slowly panning across the damp concrete floor, the moldy mattress, and the shattered plastic casing of the space heater. Every piece of broken plastic was a testament to her malicious intent. I turned the lens toward myself. On the small screen, my own body heat registered as a faint, fading orange glow against the overwhelming dark blue background of the freezing shed. I spoke directly into the built-in microphone. I stated my name and the current date and time. I meticulously detailed how Chloe Pierce entered the structure, disconnected the primary heating unit, destroyed it physically and intentionally, locked the door from the outside while leaving me exposed to sub-freezing temperatures. I held the digital thermometer up to the camera lens, clearly displaying the freezing ambient temperature. This was not negligence. This was not an accident. This was a calculated execution. I was meticulously building an airtight, undeniable federal case for the attempted murder of a senior citizen. The evidence I was gathering in the dark would ensure that Chloe never wore a designer dress again. She was going to spend the remainder of her natural life wearing a standard-issue orange prison uniform. I packed the devices away, securing them safely in the waterproof pouch hidden beneath the rotting mattress. Then the real battle began. I had to survive a night that was specifically designed to kill me. I am a man who built a vast empire from nothing in the brutal winters of Chicago. I know what cold feels like. but sitting on a concrete floor in filthy thin sweatpants with the wind cutting directly through the wood tested every ounce of my physical endurance. I crossed my legs, pulling my body into the tightest possible position to conserve my core heat. I entered a state of profound, disciplined meditation. I closed my eyes and focused the entirety of my mental energy on my breathing. I inhaled the freezing air slowly through my nose, feeling it burn my lungs, and exhaled a steady stream of white fog through my mouth. I visualized a burning furnace sitting directly in the center of my chest. I willed my heart to pump warm blood outward, pushing back against the encroaching frost. The agonizing hours dragged on in absolute silent darkness. Thin layers of white frost began to form on the inside of the wooden walls, gleaming faintly under the moonlight seeping through the cracks. My fingers and toes lost all sensation, turning completely numb. My joints ached with a deep, penetrating pain. My lips cracked and turned a pale shade of blue, but I absolutely refused to surrender to the cold. I drew an immense source of heat from the burning inferno of hatred and vengeance that fueled my soul. I pictured my twin brother Vincent lying in a warm hospital bed safely guarded by my men. I pictured Terrence and Andre standing in a federal courtroom wearing heavy iron chains. I fed that vision into the furnace inside my chest. I was going to survive to see the sun rise. I was going to watch my arrogant nephews lose absolutely everything they had ever stolen. The long, terrifying night finally surrendered to the pale gray light of Monday morning. Today was the day all the meticulously laid traps were scheduled to violently snap shut. The state psychiatric transport van was coming to haul a broken man to an asylum. The federal banking authorities were waiting for their strict 48-hour deadline to expire. And the phantom creditor, the man holding a $5 million debt, was preparing to step out of the shadows and drop the final hammer. I heard the heavy, unmistakable crunch of footsteps walking across the frozen grass outside. I immediately collapsed my body onto the damp, frozen concrete floor right next to the edge of the moldy mattress. I slowed my breathing until it was virtually imperceptible, taking only shallow sips of air. I let my muscles go completely limp. Because I had spent the entire night exposed to the freezing temperatures, my skin was genuinely like solid ice to the touch. I looked exactly like a frozen, lifeless corpse abandoned in a rotting wooden box. The heavy steel padlock rattled. The wooden doors swung open, creaking loudly on their frozen hinges. The bright morning sun poured into the freezing shed. Chloe stood in the doorway. She was wearing a heavy cashmere winter coat and holding a steaming cup of expensive coffee. She took a step inside, expecting to see me shivering and begging for mercy. Instead, she saw my rigid, motionless body lying flat on the frozen concrete. "Get up, old man," Chloe demanded, kicking my leg with the toe of her leather boot. "We do not have time for your games today. Terrence is getting the car ready. We have to take you to the bank." I did not move. I did not breathe. I remained absolutely perfectly still. Chloe frowned. Her arrogant expression faltered. She set her coffee cup down on the rusted metal barrel. She took a hesitant step closer. She crouched down and reached her manicured hand out. She pressed her bare fingers against the side of my exposed neck, searching for a pulse. My skin was like solid ice. Her fingers recoiled instantly as if she had been burned. She let out a sharp, terrified gasp. She looked closely at my face. She saw my pale blue lips. She saw the absolute stillness of my chest. The reality of what she had done the night before crashed down upon her in a crushing wave of pure panic. She had destroyed the heater out of anger, and now her leverage, her only ticket out of a massive federal fraud investigation, was lying dead on the floor. Chloe stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the moldy mattress. She scrambled out of the shed, her breath coming in rapid, hysterical pants. She grabbed her phone from her coat pocket with violently shaking hands. She dialed her husband. "Terrence!" She screamed into the phone, her voice echoing across the frozen, affluent neighborhood. "Terrence, you have to come out to the shed right now. Please come out here." "What is wrong, Chloe?" Terrence yelled back through the phone, his voice laced with his own mounting terror. Chloe stared at my motionless body, her eyes wide with absolute horrifying realization. "Terrence," she sobbed uncontrollably, her voice breaking into a high-pitched wail. "The old man is dead. He froze to death. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. I lay perfectly still on the freezing concrete floor of the shed. My eyes were closed, but my hearing was razor sharp. I listened to Chloe sobbing hysterically outside the wooden doors. Her panicked phone call had shattered the quiet Monday morning. Less than 2 minutes later, I heard the heavy, frantic footsteps of two men sprinting across the frosted grass. It was Terrence and Andre. They burst through the open doorway of the shed, gasping for cold air. Terrence stopped dead in his tracks. I could feel the sudden shift in the air pressure as the two brothers stared down at my rigid, frozen body. "What did you do?" Chloe Terrence demanded, his voice completely stripped of its usual arrogant command. His tone was hollow and filled with absolute terror. "I told you we needed him alive today. I told you we had to take him to the federal bank. I did not do anything." Chloe lied, weeping loudly. "I just came out here to bring him his morning coffee and he was lying on the floor. He must have frozen to death during the night. The heater is broken." Andre let out a high-pitched noise that sounded like a wounded animal. He pushed past Terrence and fell to his knees right next to my head. I could smell the expensive cologne radiating off his tailored suit. I felt his trembling fingers press against the side of my neck. My skin was like solid ice after enduring a night of sub-zero temperatures. I kept my breathing so shallow it was practically non-existent. I slowed my heart rate down to a slow, faint thump, mimicking the final stages of complete systemic failure. "He is cold," Terrence Andre whispered, pulling his hand back as if he had touched a venomous snake. "There is no pulse. He is gone. Our father is dead." Terrence let out a string of vicious curses. He paced back and forth across the small dirt patch just outside the wooden doors. He was not mourning the loss of his father. He was mourning the loss of his $5 million offshore wire transfer. He was mourning the loss of his freedom. If Vincent Pierce was dead, they could never walk him into the federal banking headquarters. They could never verify his identity to unfreeze the stolen funds. The trap set by the phantom creditor had just snapped completely shut, and they thought the only key to the lock had just frozen to death in their backyard. "We are ruined!" Andre cried, gripping the lapels of his expensive jacket. "The bank is going to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation. When the agents come here looking for him, they are going to find a corpse in a locked shed. They will do an autopsy. They will see the malnutrition and the bed sores. They will charge us with murder, Terrence. We are going to get the lethal injection." "Shut up, Andre." Terrence snapped, pivoting sharply. "Do not say another word. Let me think." The shed fell into a heavy, terrifying silence. I lay on the concrete, listening to the gears grinding in my nephew's head. Terrence was a cornered rat, and a cornered rat will always choose the most desperate path to survival. He was calculating the exact weight of a human life against his own selfish preservation. "We cannot let the authorities find him here," Terrence finally said, his voice dropping to a dark, conspiratorial whisper. "If the federal agents show up and the house is clean, they might just think he wandered off. We can report him missing. We can say his dementia made him wander into the woods during the night, but if they find a frozen body locked inside a shed, we are all going to prison for the rest of our lives." "What are you saying, Terrence?" Chloe asked, her voice shaking violently. "I am saying we have to get rid of the body," Terrence stated coldly. "Right now, before the sun gets any higher. We wrap him in the heavy plastic tarps from the garage. We put him in the trunk of my car. There is a deep ravine about 20 miles north of here near the old state park. We dump him over the edge. The wild animals will take care of the rest before the police ever start a grid search." "You want us to dump our own father in a ravine?" Andre asked, sounding completely horrified, but entirely willing to comply if it saved his own skin. "He is already dead," Andre Terrence growled, stepping back into the shed. "Do you want to join him? Grab his legs. We have to move fast. Chloe, go to the garage and get the heavy black plastic tarps and the industrial duct tape. Do it right now." I heard Chloe run across the frosted grass toward the main house. I felt the heavy presence of my two nephews hovering directly over my body. They were actually going to do it. They were going to wrap their father in plastic and throw him off a cliff like a piece of worthless garbage. The sheer magnitude of their depravity was absolute. They possessed absolutely zero redeeming qualities. They were monsters hiding behind designer suits and expensive haircuts. Andre reached down and grabbed my ankles. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely maintain his grip on the thin fabric of my filthy sweatpants. Terrence leaned over my head, preparing to grab me by the shoulders. I felt his hot breath on my frozen face. I felt his expensive leather shoes sliding against the damp concrete floor right next to my ear. On 3, Terrence commanded, his voice tight with adrenaline. 1, 2. He did not get to 3. The game of playing dead was officially over. I had gathered all the audio evidence I needed. They had verbally conspired to conceal a felony and dispose of a human body. It was time to give them the shock of their miserable, pathetic lives. Before Terrence could slide his hands under my shoulders, I suddenly opened my eyes. I stared directly up into his face. I widened my eyes, mimicking the absolute terror of a man waking up from a deep coma. Then I inhaled sharply. I let out a loud, violent, racking cough that shook my entire chest. I coughed so hard that my whole body lurched upward off the freezing concrete floor. I gasped for air, pulling the cold morning oxygen into my lungs with a ragged, desperate wheeze. Terrence screamed. It was not a manly shout of surprise. It was a high-pitched, blood-curdling scream of pure, absolute terror. He jumped backward, tripping over his own feet and crashing heavily into the rotting wooden wall of the shed. Andre dropped my ankles as if they had suddenly caught fire. He scrambled backward out the door, falling flat onto his back on the frosted grass. He crab-walked away from the shed, gasping in horror. I rolled onto my side, clutching my chest and coughing violently. I forced my breathing to sound wet and congested. I slowly pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, shivering uncontrollably. I looked at Terrence through my dirt-smeared face. "Terrence," I croaked, my voice raspy and weak. "It is so cold. Please do not put me in the plastic. Please do not throw me away." Terrence was pressing his back against the wooden wall, his chest heaving rapidly. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes. He had genuinely believed I was a frozen corpse. Seeing me suddenly spring to life and beg for mercy shattered his fragile nervous system. He took a long, shaky breath, realizing that his father was not dead. The relief of not having a dead body on his hands was instantly replaced by a massive, overwhelming wave of pure, furious rage. The panic mutated into absolute violent anger. He realized he still had to deal with the federal banking crisis. He still had to drag me downtown. His problems were not solved. They were merely resurrected. Terrence pushed himself off the wooden wall. He stormed across the small space and grabbed the collar of my filthy, tattered shirt. He hauled me upward with brutal force, lifting my torso off the damp concrete floor until we were face to face. "You refuse to die, you stubborn old parasite!" Terrence roared, his face twisting into a mask of pure demonic hatred. Spittle flew from his lips, hitting my dirt-covered cheeks. "You think this is a game? You think you can torture me like this? You just ruined my morning. You just ruined my entire life." I kept my body completely limp, hanging from his grip like a broken rag doll. I let my head loll to the side. "I am sorry, Terrence," I whimpered softly. "I am just so cold." "You are going to be a lot colder where you are going," Terrence screamed, shaking me violently. He pulled me closer until our noses were almost touching. "I am done playing nice. I am done feeding you. I am done keeping you out here. I just called the state medical dispatch. The transport van is arriving in exactly 2 hours. They are bringing a chemical straitjacket." He shoved me backward. I hit the frozen concrete floor hard, scraping my elbow against the rough stone. I curled into a ball, protecting my head. "This Monday, I am throwing you into solitary confinement," Terrence declared, his voice echoing with absolute finality. "You are going to spend the rest of your miserable, pathetic life locked in a padded room staring at a blank wall. You will never see the sun again. You will never speak to another human being. When we walk into that federal bank today, you are going to smile and you are going to tell the agents exactly what I tell you to say. If you say one wrong word, I will make sure the nurses at the asylum drug you until you cannot even remember your own name." He turned around and stormed out of the shed. He kicked the wooden doors completely open. Andre was still sitting on the frosted grass, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Get up, you coward!" Terrence snapped, kicking his brother in the leg. "Go inside and get the heavy winter coats. We need to warm him up before we put him in the car. We cannot walk into the bank with him looking like a frozen corpse." Andre scrambled to his feet, nodding rapidly and running toward the main house. Terrence stood in the doorway, glaring at me one last time. He pulled the heavy wooden doors shut. The steel padlock clicked into place, sealing me inside the shed once more. I lay on the floor, listening to his heavy footsteps march back toward the luxury patio. The performance was over. I had pushed them to the absolute limit. I had forced them to reveal their darkest, most violent intentions. Terrence believed he had completely reasserted his dominance. He believed he was going to force a broken old man to lie to federal agents. He believed the state transport van was his ultimate weapon. He was entirely wrong on every single count. Terrence did not know that the transport van was never going to arrive. He did not know that the corrupt medical dispatch officer he had bribed was already sitting in a federal interrogation room confessing to his crimes. More importantly, Terrence did not know that he was no longer alone on his sprawling suburban property. While Terrence and Chloe were panicking over my frozen body and screaming about ravines, the landscape of the affluent neighborhood had drastically quietly changed. Under the cover of the early morning fog, an invisible net had been pulled tight around the entire estate. My head of security, Malik, had not been idle. The tactical team I requested from Chicago had arrived. They did not drive marked police cruisers. They drove matte black, unmarked utility vehicles. They did not wear bright uniforms. They wore dark tactical gear. Over 3 dozen highly trained security operatives and private investigators had completely surrounded the perimeter of the mansion. They were positioned behind the tall hedges lining the driveway. They were stationed in the wooded area just beyond the backyard fence. They had established a secure mobile command center in a parked van at the end of the cul-de-sac. Every single exit was blocked. Every single line of sight was covered by long-range surveillance cameras. The house was entirely cut off from the rest of the world. Terrence, Andre, and Chloe were trapped inside a highly secured box, and they had absolutely no idea. I sat up on the frozen concrete floor. I brushed the dirt and frost from my tattered shirt. I reached into the deep pocket of my sweatpants and pulled out the microscopic encrypted cellular device. The screen glowed softly in the dark shed. I opened the secure messaging application. The keyboard was tiny, but my fingers were perfectly steady. The time for playing games was over. The time for hiding in the shadows was finished. I had endured the freezing cold, the physical abuse, and the profound psychological sickness of my nephews. I had gathered all the undeniable evidence required to ensure they would never see the outside of a prison wall for the rest of their natural lives. I typed a single short message to Malik. Activate everything. It is time to harvest. I hit the send button. The device confirmed the message was delivered. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I stood up tall in the center of the dark shed, rolling my shoulders and cracking my neck. I was Victor Pierce the Wolf. The cold air inside the shed no longer bothered me. The damp concrete beneath my bare feet felt like the solid foundation of my empire. I had built a legacy from the ground up by systematically dismantling those who thought they could take what was mine. My twin brother had suffered for 6 agonizing years in this exact spot, but his suffering was about to be answered with a level of vengeance that these spoiled children could not possibly comprehend. They thought they were sending a sheep to the slaughterhouse this morning. They were about to learn that the sheep was gone and the slaughterhouse belonged entirely to me. I stood facing the heavy wooden doors, waiting for the final act to begin. I was ready to tear the doors completely off this rotting wooden box. I am Victor Pierce. I am exactly 74 years old. After Terrence and Andre retreated to the main house to fetch winter coats, my nephew realized he could not risk his golden ticket wandering off or collapsing outside the shed. Terrence returned 10 minutes later holding a heavy pair of solid steel handcuffs. He did not speak. He grabbed my wrists and locked the cuffs tightly, snapping the metal chain around an exposed rusted iron pipe protruding from the concrete wall. He wanted to ensure I remained exactly where he left me until the state transport van arrived. He locked the wooden doors once more, leaving me chained like an animal. He thought the steel restraints would hold me. He did not realize that I had spent my youth working with heavy machinery and breaking structural steel. Slipping a cheap commercial handcuff was a simple matter of leverage and pain tolerance. I waited until the sound of his footsteps completely vanished. Then I braced my boots against the concrete wall, twisted my wrist to dislocate my own thumb, and forcefully ripped my hand through the steel cuff. The metal tore my skin, but I did not feel the pain. I popped my thumb back into its socket with a sharp crack. I unlocked the other cuff using a small piece of wire from the broken space heater. I stripped off the filthy sweatpants and the tattered shirt, leaving them in a pile on the damp concrete floor. I tossed the broken steel handcuffs directly on top of the dirty clothes. My men were waiting for me just beyond the tree line. I slipped out of the shed, moving like a shadow through the frosted morning grass. I left the wooden doors perfectly shut and the external padlock secured. I walked into the dense woods where Malik was waiting with a heated mobile command center and a fresh custom-tailored suit. It was time to shed the skin of the victim and step back into the armor of a true king. Inside the sprawling suburban mansion, the atmosphere was a volatile mixture of desperate greed and suffocating anxiety. At exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the heavy iron gates of the estate swung open. The driveway quickly filled with vehicles. Two sterile white medical transport vans bearing the insignia of the state psychiatric facility parked near the front portico. At the exact same moment, a sleek black luxury sedan pulled up right behind them. Harrison, my ruthless corporate attorney, stepped out of the sedan holding a pristine leather briefcase. He was playing the role of the offshore buyer representative, arriving under the guise of executing the final escrow release documents required by the federal bank. Terrence and Andre were waiting anxiously in the grand foyer. They had dressed in their most expensive suits, hoping to project an aura of complete control. They welcomed Harrison into the massive living room, offering him expensive coffee and trying to act like legitimate businessmen. Chloe hovered nervously near the marble fireplace, clutching a silk shawl around her shoulders. She kept glancing out the large bay windows toward the backyard. The pressure in the room was immense. They needed to get the psychiatric hold officially authorized by the transport medics, and they needed Harrison to sign the final federal clearing forms to unfreeze their $5 million. Terrence turned to the two massive orderlies who had entered the house with the psychiatric transport team. They were large, muscular men wearing scrubs and carrying heavy canvas restraint jackets. Terrence handed them the key to the shed padlock. He instructed them to walk out to the backyard and retrieve his father. He warned them that the old man was suffering from severe dementia and might become violent or uncooperative. He told them to use whatever chemical restraints were necessary to keep him completely silent for the trip to the federal bank. The two large orderlies nodded, gripping their restraint jackets and walking out the sliding glass patio doors. Terrence rubbed his hands together, forcing a confident smile as he turned back to Harrison. He poured a cup of coffee and promised the attorney that the final signature verification would be completed within the hour. Andre paced frantically across the Persian rug, checking his counterfeit luxury watch every 10 seconds. They thought their nightmare was finally ending. They thought they were minutes away from walking away with an absolute fortune. Out in the freezing backyard, the two massive orderlies marched across the frosted grass. They reached the dilapidated wooden shed. The taller orderly inserted the key into the heavy steel padlock. The lock clicked and he pulled it free. He grabbed the wooden handles and yanked the heavy doors wide open, expecting to find a frail, combative old man hiding in the dark. The bright morning sun flooded the interior of the concrete box. The orderlies stepped inside, raising their hands to grab their patient, but they grabbed nothing but empty air. The shed was completely vacant. The taller orderly scanned the small room in total confusion. There was no old man. There was only the moldy mattress, the shattered pieces of a broken space heater, and the freezing concrete floor. Right in the center of the room, resting exactly where the patient was supposed to be, was a pile of filthy, tattered clothes. Sitting right on top of the dirty sweatpants was a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. The metal chain connecting the cuffs was violently snapped in half, and the locking mechanism was completely crushed. The orderlies stared at the broken steel in absolute disbelief. A starving 74-year-old man dying of malnutrition could not possibly shatter solid steel handcuffs and vanish into thin air without leaving a single trace. The taller orderly pulled his radio from his belt, pressing the transmission button with a trembling thumb. He called back to the main house, his voice echoing with genuine alarm. He reported that the shed was empty. He reported that the patient was gone and the restraints were destroyed. Inside the luxurious living room, Terrence heard the radio transmission echo from the medical dispatch unit resting on the coffee table. The blood completely drained from his face. His confident, arrogant smile vanished instantly, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. Andre let out a gasp, clutching his chest as if he suffered a heart attack. Chloe dropped her coffee cup, shattering the expensive porcelain against the marble floor. "Gone," Terrence whispered, his voice trembling violently. "What do you mean he is gone? That is impossible." He was locked inside. He was chained to the wall. Harrison sat calmly on the leather sofa, opening his briefcase with slow, deliberate precision. He did not look surprised. He simply pulled out a stack of federal indictment papers. Terrence spun around frantically, looking at the front door and then at the back patio. His mind was collapsing under the weight of the impossible reality. The federal banking authorities were waiting, the criminal syndicate was waiting, the transport van was waiting, and the golden ticket, the only man who could save them from decades in a federal penitentiary, had simply evaporated. Andre began to scream hysterically, tearing at his tailored suit jacket. He yelled the old man was a demon. He yelled they were all going to die. Terrence grabbed his brother, shaking him violently, demanding he shut up. The chaos reached a deafening absolute crescendo. They were completely trapped in their collapsing lies. Then the heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the mansion burst completely open. The loud, explosive, thunderous crash of the heavy wood striking the drywall silenced the entire room instantly. Terrence, Andre, and Chloe froze, staring at the grand foyer in absolute terrified shock. The two orderlies rushed back in from the patio, stopping dead in their tracks, completely stunned. A towering, majestic figure stepped across the threshold. I did not shuffle. I did not tremble. I walked into the sprawling modern mansion with the slow, measured, heavy strides of a conquering emperor claiming his stolen throne. I was no longer wearing filthy sweatpants or smelling of stale urine and rotting wood. I was wearing a flawless, custom-tailored Italian Tom Ford suit in a deep charcoal gray. The wool fabric draped perfectly across my broad shoulders. A crisp white silk shirt collar framed my clean-shaven face. The dirt and grime were completely washed away, revealing the sharp, cold, calculating features of a ruthless predator. On my left wrist, the polished platinum face of a Patek Philippe timepiece caught the morning light, projecting a blinding glare across the marble walls. I stood silently in the exact center of the grand foyer, looking down at my pathetic, terrified nephews. The immense, suffocating weight of my absolute presence instantly crushed the remaining oxygen out of the room. I was Victor Pierce, and I had finally arrived to collect my absolute final debt. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. The grand foyer of the sprawling suburban mansion was completely silent. It was a thick, suffocating silence that felt heavier than wet concrete. The morning sun streamed through the massive skylight, illuminating the polished marble floor. I stood exactly in the center of the brilliant light. I did not move. I simply let my presence fill the entire volume of the room. The transition from the filthy, starving prisoner locked in a damp concrete shed to a towering apex predator wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit was absolutely staggering. I watched the cognitive dissonance completely short-circuit the minds of my nephews. Terrence, Andre, and Chloe stood frozen in the luxurious living room just a few feet away. They looked like statues carved out of pure terror. Their eyes were wide and unblinking. Their mouths hung slightly open. They stared at my face. They recognized the deep brown skin, the shape of my jaw, and the exact contour of my cheekbones. They saw the face of the man they had systematically tortured and starved for 6 agonizing years. But the man standing before them was not broken. He was not trembling. He was not looking at the floor in pathetic submission. I stood with my spine perfectly straight and my shoulders pulled back. I radiated the cold, lethal authority of a king stepping onto a conquered battlefield. The Tom Ford suit draped over my frame with flawless precision. The dark charcoal wool absorbed the light, while the crisp, white silk shirt projected absolute pristine power. The platinum face of my Patek Philippe watch rested elegantly against my left cuff. I was the living, breathing embodiment of the supreme wealth they had spent 6 years trying to steal. The smell of fear in the room was palpable. It radiated off their skin like a toxic perfume. They had built an entire kingdom on a foundation of cruel deception, and now the true owner of that kingdom had arrived to burn it all to the ground. Andre was the first to physically react. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to grab the back of a leather armchair just to keep himself from collapsing onto the Persian rug. He gasped for air, his chest heaving under his expensive tailored jacket. He looked at my polished leather shoes, and then slowly dragged his gaze up to my cold, dead eyes. He remembered the dark shed. He remembered the terrifying stare I had given him when he held a loaded gun to my chest. He finally understood that the demon he saw in the darkness was standing right in his living room in broad daylight. He realized that the sheer terror he felt that night was entirely justified. The man in the shed was never his victim. The man in the shed was his executioner. Chloe took a slow, trembling step backward. She wrapped her silk shawl tighter around her shoulders as if trying to protect herself from the sudden freezing temperature of the room. She looked at my pristine clothes. She knew exactly how much my suit cost. She knew the value of the watch on my wrist. Her greedy, calculating mind could not process how the filthy, starving animal she had left to freeze to death the night before was now dressed in garments that cost more than her entire luxury wardrobe. The reality of her impending destruction began to settle deeply into her bones. She had stomped on a space heater to punish a frail old man, but the man standing in front of her could freeze her bank accounts and destroy her life with a single phone call. Terrence tried to maintain his arrogant facade. He was the mastermind. He was the one who believed he controlled the entire universe. But his hands were shaking so violently, he had to press them flat against the sides of his trousers. He took a hesitant half-step forward. His brain desperately tried to rationalize the impossible image standing in his foyer. He needed to believe that this was still his helpless father. He needed to believe that somehow the old man had escaped, found a stash of hidden money, and bought a suit to play a final desperate trick on him. He could not accept that he had been completely outsmarted. Dad Terrence stammered, his voice completely devoid of its usual booming confidence. His words came out as a weak, pathetic croak. "Dad, why are you wearing those clothes?" I did not answer him. I did not blink. I simply stared at him with an expression of profound, absolute disgust. I looked at him the way a man looks at a cockroach scurrying across a pristine dining table. I wanted him to feel the absolute crushing weight of his own insignificance. Terrence swallowed hard. The thick knot in his throat bobbed up and down. "How did you get out of the shed?" Terrence continued, his voice rising in pitch as panic began to completely overwhelm his logic. "Where did you get that suit? You are supposed to be out back. The transport van is here. You need to take those clothes off right now and go with the medics." The two massive orderlies from the state psychiatric facility stood near the sliding glass patio doors. They dropped their heavy canvas restraint jackets onto the floor. They looked at Terrence, and then they looked at me. They were not fools. They recognized that the towering billionaire standing in the foyer was not a dementia patient requiring chemical sedation. They slowly backed away from the center of the room, wanting absolutely no part in whatever dark, twisted family nightmare they had just walked into. They realized they had been hired to participate in a massive illegal kidnapping, and they wanted to erase their involvement immediately. Harrison, my corporate attorney, sat calmly on the leather sofa. He closed his pristine briefcase with a soft, definitive click. He looked at Terrence with a mild, highly amused expression. Harrison knew exactly what was about to happen. He had set the final legal trap, and now he was simply enjoying the front row seat to the execution. The federal banking alerts were real. The frozen funds were real. And the man who had orchestrated the entire financial slaughter was standing right in the middle of the room. Terrence took another step forward, reaching his shaking hand out toward me. "I am talking to you, old man," Terrence yelled, his fear rapidly mutating into desperate anger. "Answer me right now before I make the orderlies drag you out of here by your neck," before his trembling fingers could even come close to the fabric of my suit. The heavy mahogany double doors behind me opened completely. The sound of rubber wheels rolling smoothly across the polished marble floor echoed through the silent grand foyer. Everyone in the living room shifted their gaze from my face to the open doorway. The bright morning sun cast a long shadow across the entrance. Malik, my head of security, stepped into the bright morning light. He was wearing a dark tactical suit and a completely expressionless face. His massive frame filled the doorway, projecting absolute physical dominance. His hands were resting firmly on the handles of a high-end medical wheelchair. He pushed the wheelchair slowly and deliberately over the threshold and into the grand foyer, stopping right beside me. Sitting in the wheelchair was a frail old man. He was wearing a soft, clean cashmere sweater and comfortable slacks. A thin, clear medical tube ran across his cheek, supplying him with pure, steady oxygen. A discreet intravenous line was taped to the back of his hand, feeding vital nutrients and antibiotics directly into his recovering bloodstream. His face was entirely clean-shaven, exposing the deep, hollow contours of his cheeks. His hair was neatly trimmed and brushed. He looked fragile, but he was completely safe and entirely lucid. It was Vincent Pierce, the real Vincent Pierce, the father they had starved and locked in a rotting wooden box for 6 years, the man they had replaced with a phantom in their own minds. Vincent did not look angry. He did not look vengeful. He looked at Terrence and Andre with an expression of absolute, profound, agonizing sorrow. Tears welled in his deep brown eyes and spilled silently down his hollow cheeks. He looked at the two boys he had raised, the boys he had loved and sacrificed everything for. And he saw exactly what they had become. He saw the monsters hiding beneath their expensive haircuts and tailored suits. He saw the cold, calculated cruelty that had allowed them to treat him like a disposable animal. The silence in the room became completely deafening. It was a silence so heavy it felt like the entire mansion was sinking directly into the earth. The air conditioning hummed softly in the background, but it was the only sound in the vast, luxurious space. Terrence, Andre, and Chloe stared at the wheelchair. Then they slowly turned their heads and stared at me. Then they looked back at the wheelchair. Their minds violently shattered. They saw the exact same face twice. They saw the deep brown skin, the shape of the jaw, and the contour of the cheekbones replicated perfectly. One face was frail, weeping, and broken. The other face was a towering monument of cold, absolute lethal power. They saw the sheep and they saw the wolf standing side by side in their own living room. The impossible reality finally crashed down upon them like a collapsing skyscraper. The man they had been torturing in the shed for the past 2 days, the man who had signed the federal banking documents, the man who had recorded their confessions and purchased their criminal debt was not their father. Their father had been rescued. Their father was safe. They had locked a completely different human being inside their backyard prison. They had locked a billionaire apex predator in a wooden box and handed him all the tools he needed to destroy their lives. Who? Andre whispered, falling to his knees on the Persian rug. His voice was a thin, terrified breath. He could not process the dual existence of the two men in front of him. Who are you? Terrence stumbled backward, crashing into the edge of the glass coffee table. He knocked over a crystal vase, sending water and expensive flowers spilling across the floor. He looked at me with eyes full of pure, unadulterated horror. You are not him, Terrence gasped, clutching his chest as his heart hammered wildly against his ribs. You are not my father. I took one single, deliberate step forward. The sound of my leather shoe striking the marble floor echoed like a gunshot. I looked down at the pathetic, groveling creatures who had tortured my twin brother. The time for playing the victim was permanently over. The disguise was completely discarded. The financial trap was fully armed and the emotional execution was about to commence. He is not your father, I roared, my voice dropping to a dark, thunderous rumble that violently shook the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. I watched the last remaining shred of hope drain entirely out of their pathetic faces. I let the full, terrifying weight of my true identity drop directly onto their shoulders. I wanted them to know exactly who had orchestrated their total and absolute downfall. I am Victor Pierce. I declared the name hanging in the cold air like an absolute death sentence. And you just sold your lives to me. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. The name hung in the cold air of the living room like a heavy steel blade. Victor Pierce, the billionaire real estate mogul from Chicago, the ruthless predator they heard stories about but never met. I watched their eyes dart back and forth between my immaculate custom suit and the fragile, broken man sitting in the wheelchair beside me. My twin brother Vincent wept silently, his tears falling onto his soft cashmere sweater. He mourned the absolute corruption of his own flesh and blood. But I did not come here to mourn. I came here to execute a total and absolute financial slaughter. I stepped past the massive psychiatric orderlies who were pressing themselves flat against the glass patio doors, desperately trying to become invisible. I walked directly toward the center of the living room. My leather shoes clicked sharply against the polished marble floor and then sank silently into the thick Persian rug. Terrence scrambled backward, tripping over the broken crystal vase he knocked over moments ago. Andre remained entirely frozen on his knees, staring up at me with a blank expression of pure, paralyzing shock. I stopped in front of the glass coffee table. I reached inside the breast pocket of my tailored Tom Ford suit jacket. I pulled out a thick manila folder. I tossed it onto the glass table. It landed with a loud, definitive smack, making Chloe jump. "What is that?" Terrence whispered, his voice shaking uncontrollably as he stared at the folder. "That is your entire pathetic future," I replied, my voice low and echoing with lethal authority. "Open it, Terrence. Look at the chains you willingly wrapped around your own neck." Terrence hesitated, his hands trembling violently. He slowly reached out and opened the cover of the folder. He looked at the documents resting on top. The color drained from his pale face. He recognized the heavy black ink and the harsh legal terminology. It was the exact cross-collateralized loan agreement he had signed with the violent underground criminal syndicate. It was the $5 million shark loan he took out to fund his fake startup company. But the creditor name at the top of the agreement was completely different. The Shadow Corporation had been legally replaced. "I am the phantom creditor, Terrence," I stated coldly, letting the reality crush his lungs. "When you locked me in that rotting shed, I used an encrypted satellite device to contact my legal team in Chicago. I purchased your toxic $5 million debt from the syndicate at a massive premium. I bought the paper and I bought the collateral rights. I am your sole lien holder. You do not owe the mob anymore. You owe me. And I do not offer payment plans or extensions. I collect immediately." Andre let out a high-pitched gasp, clutching his head with both hands. "We are completely ruined," he sobbed, rocking back and forth on his knees. "He owns everything." "You own nothing," I corrected him, my eyes locking onto Andre's pathetic weeping form. "You have absolutely zero assets. You have zero leverage. But financial ruin is just the beginning of your punishment." I turned my gaze away from my nephews and locked my eyes directly onto Chloe. She was standing near the marble fireplace, clutching her silk shawl, her face a mask of pure terror. She tried to look like an innocent victim trapped in a nightmare. She tried to play the role of the devoted wife who knew nothing about the horrific abuse happening in her backyard. "You thought you were so incredibly clever, Chloe," I said, my voice dripping with absolute disgust. "You thought you could stomp on a space heater and freeze a helpless old man to death to punish your husband for a frozen bank transfer. You thought you were the queen of this stolen castle. But queens are supposed to be loyal to their kings. When I broke out of the shed on Saturday night, I broke into your main house," I explained to my nephew. "I accessed your computer in the study. I mirrored your entire hard drive. I read every single file. I found the offshore accounts you set up, Terrence. But I also found the secret accounts your lovely wife set up completely behind your back." Chloe gasped loudly, covering her mouth with her manicured hands. "No," she whimpered, shaking her head frantically. "No, you are lying." "I am not lying, Chloe," I stated firmly, projecting my voice so every person in the room heard the absolute truth. "You secretly siphoned over $400,000 out of the syndicate loan advance. You routed it through a dummy corporation registered in your maiden name. I found the digital receipts for the 2 first-class plane tickets to Paris you booked yesterday morning. You were never planning to go to Monaco with Terrence. You were planning to leave him holding the bag for the federal fraud while you fled the country with your personal fitness instructor." Terrence slowly stood up from the sofa. His legs were shaking, but his face was twisting into a mask of pure homicidal betrayal. He stared at his wife. He saw the absolute panic in her eyes, and he knew instantly that every single word I said was entirely true. "You stole from me!" Terrence roared, taking a threatening step toward Chloe. "I locked my own father in a shed to get that money, and you were going to steal it from me and run away with some pathetic gym trainer." I stepped smoothly between them, holding my hand up to stop Terrence. "You can settle your marital disputes in federal prison, Terrence," I commanded, forcing him to step back. "Because neither of you are ever leaving this country. You are both going to die in a concrete cage." I turned my attention to Harrison, who was sitting quietly on the leather sofa holding his pristine briefcase. "Harrison," I said, nodding toward my corporate attorney, "explain the banking trap to my arrogant nephews. Let them understand exactly how tightly the noose is tied around their miserable necks." Harrison stood up, smoothing the front of his expensive suit. He looked at Terrence and Andre with the mild, detached amusement of a scientist observing insects under a microscope. "When you presented that land deed to me this morning," Harrison began, "you believed you were satisfying the escrow requirements to unfreeze your $5 million, but you failed to verify the signature. The man you locked in the shed did not sign Vincent Pierce. He legally signed his true name, Victor Pierce. By handing me that forged document to authorize a wire transfer, you committed a Class A federal wire fraud," Harrison continued. "My firm acts as a proxy for the federal banking network. The $5 million was never coming. The money was seized by the Financial Crimes Division. Your accounts are frozen. Your passports are revoked. The federal indictment is finalized." Terrence collapsed backward onto the leather sofa. He buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, gut-wrenching wail of absolute despair. His entire life was officially over. He had lost his money, his wife, his freedom, and his soul. He was a broken, hollow shell. Andre was still on his knees on the Persian rug. The sheer magnitude of the catastrophic failure finally shattered the last remaining fragile pieces of his sanity. He realized he was never going to be rich. He realized he was going to spend 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary surrounded by violent predators. The suffocating terror mutated instantly into blinding, uncontrollable rage. "It is all your fault!" Andre shrieked, spit flying from his lips. "You ruined everything. You should have died in that shed." Andre lunged upward onto his feet. His right hand reached desperately inside the interior pocket of his wrinkled linen suit jacket. He pulled out the sleek black compact semi-automatic pistol he pointed at me in the dark shed 2 nights ago. He raised the weapon, extending his arm and aiming the barrel directly at the center of my chest. His finger slammed against the metal trigger. He wanted to kill me. He wanted to end the nightmare by putting a bullet straight through my heart right there in his luxurious living room. Before Andre could apply pressure to the metal trigger, Malik moved with sudden explosive violence. My head of security closed the distance in a fraction of a second. Malik grabbed the handgun slide, pushing it upward as it discharged into the ceiling. Simultaneously, he grabbed Andre's right wrist, twisting his arm completely backward. The sound of Andre's bones snapping echoed loudly. Malik kicked his legs out, pinning him to the floor. The violent disarmament took exactly 1 second. Andre sobbed, clutching his broken arm. "You should have checked the lock before inviting a wolf into your house. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old." The deafening roar of the gunshot fired by Andre echoed through the massive luxury living room, tearing through the suffocating silence. The bullet had buried itself harmlessly into the expensive vaulted ceiling, but the smell of burnt gunpowder instantly filled the air. Malik kept his knee planted firmly against the back of Andre's neck, holding him flat against the Persian rug. Andre wailed in absolute agony, clutching his completely shattered right arm. The bone was broken. The fight was entirely over. But the true punishment had not even begun. Before Terrence could even process the violent disarmament of his younger brother, a new sound pierced the quiet morning air of the affluent Atlanta suburb. It started as a distant, high-pitched wail. Within seconds, the sound multiplied and amplified into a deafening chorus of heavy mechanical sirens. The noise vibrated through the glass of the large bay windows. Terrence scrambled away from the coffee table, pressing his back against the marble fireplace. He looked out the window. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated terror. He expected to see standard blue and red flashing lights from local police cruisers. He thought perhaps a neighbor had called the local authorities because of the gunshot. He was completely wrong. A massive convoy of matte black armored utility vehicles tore up the long paved driveway, crushing the expensive manicured landscaping beneath their heavy tires. They were not local police responding to a noise complaint. They were a highly coordinated federal tactical unit. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially arrived to dismantle the criminal empire my nephews had built on my brother's suffering. The heavy mahogany double doors of the grand foyer had already been thrown open by Malik. The federal agents did not bother knocking. A dozen heavily armed operatives wearing dark tactical gear and protective vests swarmed into the grand foyer and flooded the living room. They moved with terrifying, absolute precision. Their heavy boots slammed against the polished marble floors. The chaotic energy of my arrogant nephews evaporated in the face of overwhelming, undeniable force. "Get down on the ground," a lead federal agent roared, pointing his weapon directly at Terrence. "Show me your hands right now." Terrence did not hesitate. The arrogant venture capitalist who had bragged about spending millions in Monaco completely collapsed. He fell to his knees and pressed his face flat against his own expensive floor, interlacing his trembling fingers behind his head. Chloe let out a high-pitched, hysterical scream, dropping her silk shawl and dropping to the floor beside her husband. The 2 massive orderlies from the psychiatric facility who had planned to drag my brother away in a chemical straitjacket immediately dropped to their knees and raised their hands high in the air, surrendering instantly to avoid federal charges. Malik calmly stepped back from Andre, allowing 2 federal agents to haul the screaming younger brother off the rug and secure his uninjured wrist with heavy steel handcuffs. The entire living room was instantly transformed from a palace of stolen wealth into a highly secure federal crime scene. The predators were finally in cages. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored Italian suit. I watched the agents secure the perimeter. A tall, authoritative man wearing a dark suit and a gold federal badge hanging from his belt walked through the front doors. He was Special Agent Reynolds, the head of the Financial Crimes and Elder Abuse Task Force in Atlanta. He walked directly toward me, bypassing the pathetic figures groveling on the floor. Behind him, two more agents dragged a familiar figure into the living room. It was Dr. Evans. The corrupt neurologist was wearing a wrinkled dress shirt and heavy iron handcuffs. His perfect silver hair was an absolute mess. His face was entirely pale and covered in a thick sheen of nervous sweat. He looked completely broken. The agents forced the corrupt doctor to his knees right next to Terrence. Terrence turned his head slightly, looking at the doctor in pure shock. Dr. Evans refused to make eye contact, staring entirely at the floor. He had already confessed everything. He had traded his wealthy clients for a plea deal the moment the federal agents kicked down the door of his private clinic an hour earlier. Special Agent Reynolds stopped in front of me, extending his hand. "Mr. Pierce," he said with profound professional respect, "we received the encrypted transmissions from your legal team in Chicago. The perimeter is fully secured and the offshore accounts are officially frozen. Do you have the physical evidence?" I nodded slowly. I reached into the interior pockets of my Tom Ford suit jacket. I pulled out the completely undeniable proof of their monstrous crimes. I handed Special Agent Reynolds the 2 digital storage drives I had mirrored from Terrence's computer, containing every single fraudulent wire transfer and forged document. I handed him the high-resolution thermal imaging camera that perfectly captured Chloe, maliciously destroying the space heater and leaving me to freeze to death in the rotting shed. I handed him the digital audio recorder containing the exact moment Terrence bragged about bribing a medical professional to falsely diagnose his father with severe dementia. And finally, I pointed to the heavy manila folder resting on the glass coffee table containing the $5 million underground syndicate loan they had secured using a forged federal signature. "I have given you the financial records, the audio confessions, and the thermal evidence of attempted murder," I stated, my voice echoing coldly across the silent room. "You have the corrupt doctor who signed the fake medical evaluations. You have the 2 orderlies hired to facilitate a kidnapping. The investigation is completely finished, Agent Reynolds. I want them charged with federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit medical malpractice, severe elder abuse, and attempted homicide. I want every single piece of property they purchased with stolen funds liquidated immediately. I want them stripped down to absolutely nothing." Agent Reynolds took the evidence and nodded firmly. "They will not see the outside of a federal penitentiary for the next 30 years, Mr. Pierce," he assured me. Terrence lay on the floor listening to the massive list of federal charges being brought against him. The illusion of his genius was entirely shattered. He realized that the filthy old man in the shed had outsmarted him at every single conceivable turn. He had been completely manipulated, exposed, and destroyed by the very person he thought was a helpless animal. He felt the cold steel of the handcuffs bite viciously into his wrists as a federal agent secured his arms behind his back. The absolute finality of his situation crashed down upon him. He was going to lose his luxurious home. He was going to lose his expensive cars. He was going to spend his life in a concrete box far worse than the wooden shed in his backyard. Desperation overwhelmed his remaining pride. He twisted his body, fighting against the grip of the federal agent. He pushed himself up onto his knees, dragging his chained hands behind him. He did not look at me. He knew I had absolutely zero mercy to offer him. Instead, he turned his desperate, tear-filled eyes toward the wheelchair resting quietly in the center of the room. He looked at the frail, clean-shaven man breathing softly through a clear oxygen tube. He looked at his actual father. "Dad," Terrence sobbed, his voice cracking with pathetic, ugly desperation. He began to crawl across the Persian rug, dragging his knees across the floor toward the wheelchair. "Dad, please, you have to help us. Please tell them to stop. Tell them it was all a big misunderstanding. We were just trying to protect your money. We were just trying to keep you safe from yourself. I am your son, Dad. I am your oldest boy. You cannot let them take me away to prison. You cannot let them lock me in a cage. Please, Daddy, please save me." He wept uncontrollably, the tears streaming down his face and dripping onto the collar of his expensive dress shirt. He was begging for salvation from the very man he had starved and tortured for 6 agonizing years. He expected the gentle, mild-mannered accountant to forgive him. He expected the sheep to pardon the wolf. Vincent Pierce sat perfectly still in his medical wheelchair. The quiet, gentle accountant who had worked his entire life to provide a beautiful home for his children looked down at the pathetic, groveling creature weeping at his feet. Vincent did not reach out to comfort his son. He did not offer a warm smile of forgiveness. The 6 years of freezing winters, the 6 years of starvation, the 6 years of absolute psychological torment in the dark shed had permanently burned away the soft, forgiving nature of his heart. Vincent looked at Terence. He looked at Andre, who was sobbing and clutching his broken arm. He looked at Chloe, who was weeping hysterically as the federal agents read her the Miranda rights. He saw them for exactly what they were. They were violent, greedy parasites who had traded their own humanity for designer clothes and luxury cars. Vincent slowly turned his head. He looked away from Terence's desperate, pleading eyes. He looked out the large glass bay windows toward the backyard. He looked at the rotting wooden shed standing in the cold morning sunlight. He took a slow, deep breath, pulling the pure oxygen into his recovering lungs. He did not raise his voice. He did not yell. He spoke with a quiet, absolute certainty that cut through the chaotic noise of the federal raid like a sharpened blade. He delivered the final, completely devastating blow to his arrogant, cruel children. "You killed your father 6 years ago," Vincent whispered into the cold silence of the room. "I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old." The heavy silence that followed my brother Vincent's final, absolute statement was broken only by the pathetic sobbing of the people on the floor. Terence collapsed completely against the Persian rug, his entire spirit completely broken by the absolute rejection from his father. But a rat will always fight blindly when cornered. The loyalty among thieves is a fragile illusion that shatters the moment the federal handcuffs appear. Chloe realized that her husband was entirely defeated. She realized that the fake medical evaluations and the frozen $5 million wire transfer were going to send him to federal prison for a very long time. Her survival instinct kicked in, overriding whatever fake love she had pretended to have for Terence over the last 6 years. Chloe frantically scrambled to her knees, pushing her blonde hair out of her tear-streaked face. She turned her body away from her husband and looked directly up at Special Agent Reynolds. She clasped her manicured hands together in a desperate, pleading gesture. "Please listen to me," Chloe begged, her voice shaking with a manufactured, terrified innocence. "I did not know anything about this. I swear to you, I am just a victim in all of this. Terence and Andre are monsters. They forced me to go along with their plan. They threatened me. They said if I ever told the police about the old man in the shed, they would hurt me. I was terrified for my life. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I never wanted any of this money. You have to give me immunity. I will testify against both of them in federal court. I will tell you everything they did. Just please do not put me in handcuffs. I am an innocent woman." Terence lifted his head from the carpet, staring at his wife in absolute, pure, unadulterated disbelief. The ultimate betrayal stabbed him directly in the back. "You lying snake!" Terence hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "You spent all the money. You bought the designer bags. You booked the flights to Paris with your lover. You loved watching him suffer. Shut up, Terence." Chloe screamed back hysterically, pointing a trembling finger at him. "You are a psychopath. You locked your own father in a rotting wooden box. I am not going to a federal prison because of your disgusting greed. Agent Reynolds, please, you have to believe me. I never went out to that shed. I never touched him. I am innocent." I stood watching her pathetic, theatrical performance with a cold, dark amusement. The absolute sheer audacity of her lies was staggering. She was willing to completely destroy the man she married just to save her own skin. But I had anticipated her cowardice. I had anticipated that she would try to play the innocent suburban wife caught in a criminal web. I reached into the pocket of my tailored Tom Ford suit jacket. I pulled out the small encrypted digital recording device. I held it up in the air, letting the morning sun reflect off the black metal casing. "You are a terrible liar, Chloe." I stated, my voice completely flat and devoid of any mercy. "You were not a hostage in this house. You were the most vicious predator of them all. When your husband panicked about the frozen bank funds last night, you decided to take matters into your own hands. You decided that the old man in the shed was nothing but a liability. You walked out into the freezing cold, and you did not go out there to bring him a blanket." I pressed the playback button on the digital device. I turned the volume to maximum. The crystal-clear audio recording echoed perfectly through the massive, luxurious living room. Every federal agent in the room stopped moving and listened. The voice on the recording was unmistakably Chloe. Her sharp, arrogant tone was captured flawlessly. No more heat for the parasite. The recording played her voice dripping with venomous cruelty. Let us see how smart you feel when you are freezing to death in the dark. Maybe the cold will fix your broken brain by tomorrow morning. The recording stopped. The absolute lethal reality of her own words hung heavily in the quiet room. Chloe froze completely. Her eyes widened to the size of saucers. Her jaw dropped open, but no sound came out. The fake tears instantly dried up on her pale cheeks. She stared at the small black device in my hand, as if it were a loaded gun, pointed directly at her head. That recording was taken at exactly 2:00 in the morning, I explained, looking directly at Special Agent Reynolds. The ambient temperature was 25 degrees. She intentionally destroyed the only heat source in the shed and locked the door from the outside. She did not just neglect a senior citizen. She actively attempted to execute him by freezing him to death. She wanted to kill the old man to solve her financial problems. That is premeditated attempted murder. Special Agent Reynolds nodded, his face completely hardened with absolute professional disgust. He looked down at Chloe. "There will be no immunity deals for you today, miss," he stated coldly. "You are going away for a very long time. Cuff her and read her the rights." Two female federal agents stepped forward immediately. They grabbed Chloe's arms and hauled her roughly to her feet. Chloe began to kick and scream wildly, thrashing against their grip like a wild animal. She shrieked that her life was ruined. She shrieked that it was not fair. The agents ignored her completely effortlessly, forcing her arms behind her back and snapping the heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. The cold metal completely shattered her illusion of luxury. Terrence and Andre were hauled to their feet next. Their expensive tailored suits were wrinkled and covered in dust from the floor. They looked like entirely broken men. Their arrogant venture capitalist masks were permanently destroyed. They were nothing but pathetic cowards facing the ultimate terrifying consequences of their own monstrous greed. "Before you take them out, Agent Reynolds," I said, taking a slow, deliberate step toward my nephews. "I want them to understand exactly what they are leaving behind." I stopped right in front of Terrence. He refused to look me in the eye, staring down at my polished leather shoes. "You thought you were brilliant, Terrence," I whispered, my voice dropping to a dark, lethal rumble. "You thought you could steal a fortune and live like a king. But you never owned any of this. It was all a complete lie. And now the lie is entirely over. My legal team executed the final asset forfeiture protocols 10 minutes ago. Every single bank account you possess is completely drained. Every credit card is permanently frozen. This massive house, the luxury cars in the driveway, the expensive furniture, all of it is officially seized by my holding company to repay the $5 million syndicate loan you fraudulently secured. You are leaving this property with absolutely nothing but the clothes on your backs." Terrence closed his eyes, a single tear escaping and rolling down his cheek. He had lost everything. He had lost his freedom, his wealth, his wife, and his father. He was an empty shell, completely hollowed out by his own blinding greed. "Take them away," I commanded, turning my back on them completely. I am done looking at them. The federal agents moved with swift, absolute efficiency. They marched Terrence, Andre, and Chloe across the grand foyer. The heavy mahogany double doors stood wide open. Outside, the bright morning sun illuminated the massive convoy of armored federal vehicles parked in the driveway. The neighbors in the affluent suburb had all stepped out of their mansions, standing on their manicured lawns, watching in absolute shock as the fake wealthy family was dragged out in heavy iron chains. Chloe continued to scream and cry as the agents shoved her into the back of a black utility vehicle. Her designer high heels scraped against the pavement. Terrence walked with his head bowed, completely defeated, offering absolutely no resistance. Andre sobbed loudly, holding his broken arm tightly against his chest as he was pushed into a separate transport van. The heavy steel doors of the federal vehicles slammed shut with a series of loud, definitive bangs, sealing their terrifying fates. They were heading to a federal holding facility where they would await a trial that would inevitably end with a 30-year sentence in a maximum security penitentiary. The convoy of black vehicles slowly rolled down the long driveway. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the distance. The federal agents cleared out of the house, taking the massive boxes of collected evidence with them. The two corrupt psychiatric orderlies were hauled away in the back of a local police cruiser. The corrupt doctor followed them in another car. The criminal infection that had plagued my brother's life was finally completely eradicated. The sprawling suburban mansion suddenly became entirely silent. The chaotic, deafening noise of the federal raid vanished, replaced by the quiet humming of the central air conditioning system. The bright morning sunlight streamed through the large bay windows, warming the polished marble floors and the expensive Persian rugs. The house was finally completely clean. Malik stood near the grand entrance, adjusting his dark tactical suit. He looked around the empty living room and then nodded silently to me. He stepped outside, pulling the heavy mahogany double doors shut behind him, giving us total privacy. He stood guard on the front porch, ensuring that absolutely no one disturbed the peace we had just fought so viciously to reclaim. I walked slowly across the massive living room. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the freezing night and the intense morning raid slowly began to fade away. I felt the heavy weight of my 74 years settling back into my bones. I took a deep breath, feeling the absolute profound silence of the empty house. I walked over to the medical wheelchair, resting quietly in the center of the room. My twin brother Vincent sat perfectly still. He was looking out the large glass windows, staring at the green grass and the tall trees bordering the property. The clear medical tube resting across his cheek delivered a steady flow of oxygen to his recovering lungs. The intravenous line taped to his hand provided the vital nutrients his starved body so desperately needed. He looked frail, but the deep, agonizing terror that had haunted his eyes for 6 years was entirely gone. I reached out and pulled a heavy leather armchair closer to his wheelchair. I sat down heavily, letting my body sink into the expensive furniture. I rested my elbows on my knees and clasped my hands together. I did not speak right away. I simply sat beside him, sharing the quiet, peaceful morning light. We had survived a terrible, horrific nightmare. We had walked through the dark valley of death, and we had emerged completely victorious on the other side. Vincent slowly turned his head. He looked at me, his deep brown eyes filled with a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude. He reached out with his trembling, frail hand. I unclasped my hands and reached back, taking his thin fingers in my firm, strong grip. We held onto each other tightly. Two brothers completely reunited after a decade of foolish silence. The house was completely silent. The monsters were permanently gone. The long, terrifying winter was finally over. We sat together in the warm sun, completely ready to begin again. I am Victor Pierce. I am 74 years old. Exactly 3 months have passed since the morning I tore the heavy mahogany doors open and destroyed the false kingdom my nephews built. The freezing winter in Atlanta gave way to a brisk, crisp spring, but we did not stay to watch the seasons change. I brought my twin brother Vincent home to Chicago. He currently lives with me in a highly secure private estate overlooking the massive dark waters of Lake Michigan. He has a team of dedicated medical professionals monitoring his physical and mental recovery every single day. The transformation is absolutely miraculous. He has gained 20 pounds of healthy weight. The hollow, dark circles under his eyes have completely vanished, replaced by the bright, intelligent spark I remember from our youth. He walks the sprawling, manicured grounds of my estate every morning, breathing in the fresh, clean air of freedom. He is no longer a starving prisoner locked in a rotting wooden box. He is a king sitting comfortably inside an impenetrable fortress made of stone and steel. I made a silent promise to myself that he will never experience a single moment of fear or cold for the rest of his natural life. While Vincent heals in absolute luxury, the monsters who tortured him are facing the brutal, unforgiving machinery of the federal justice system. Last Tuesday, I flew back to Atlanta. I sat in the front row of a massive federal courtroom located in the downtown district. I wore a dark, custom-tailored suit. I sat perfectly still, resting my hands on my wooden cane, watching the final pathetic chapter of their miserable lives unfold. Terrence and Andre were led into the courtroom by armed federal marshals. They were wearing bright orange prison jumpsuits. Their wrists and ankles were bound by heavy iron chains that rattled loudly and pathetically with every single step they took across the polished floor. They looked incredibly old and entirely broken. The stress of federal holding had completely stripped away their arrogant venture capitalist personas. Their expensive haircuts were gone. Their skin was pale and sickly. They did not look at me. They stared at the wooden floor, completely crushed by the reality of their massive, catastrophic failure. The federal judge was a stern, unforgiving woman who possessed absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar criminals who abused the elderly. She read the endless list of charges out loud for the public record: wire fraud, conspiracy to commit medical malpractice, severe elder abuse, forgery, extortion. She looked down at Terrence and Andre with profound, absolute disgust. She told them they were a disgrace to humanity. She did not offer them a single ounce of mercy or leniency. She sentenced both of them to 30 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. They will be in their late 60s by the time they ever see the outside of a concrete wall again. Andre openly wept in the courtroom, burying his face in his chained hands and sobbing loudly for his lost future. Terrence simply stared blankly ahead, a hollow, empty shell of a man who had traded his entire existence for absolute nothing. Chloe faced a completely different kind of total destruction. She tried desperately to play the innocent victim, but the thermal video and the audio recording of her cruel, malicious voice completely destroyed her fragile defense. The federal prosecutor methodically dismantled her entire life. She was sentenced to 15 years for her active role in the conspiracy and her deliberate attempted murder of my brother. But the financial and personal ruin was far worse than the heavy prison sentence. Because of her federal convictions and her documented severe abuse, the state immediately and permanently stripped her of all maternal rights. Her child was placed in a secure, loving foster home entirely far away from the toxic poison of the Pierce family. The dummy corporation she used to hide her stolen money was completely liquidated by my legal team. We seized every single designer bag, every piece of expensive jewelry, and every luxury vehicle she had ever purchased. She entered the federal prison system with absolutely nothing. Her fake high society life was permanently reduced to a cold metal bed and a steel toilet. I did not just destroy them physically and legally. I completely erased their legacy. I took the millions of dollars I recovered from liquidating their assets, and I restored Vincent's entire financial portfolio. I bought back his commercial properties downtown. I secured his massive retirement pension. I placed his entire fortune into an ironclad, irrevocable trust that no greedy relative could ever infiltrate or touch again. I protected my blood. I did exactly what a twin brother is supposed to do. This morning, Vincent and I sat together on the massive stone balcony of my Chicago estate. We drank hot, dark coffee and watched the bright sun rise over the beautiful, towering city skyline. He looked at me and smiled. It was a genuine, warm smile that reached his deep brown eyes and erased the shadows of the past. The decade of foolish pride and silence between us is permanently erased. We are twin brothers standing together against the world, just like we did when we were young boys growing up on the rough streets of the South Side. The violent storm is completely over. We did not just survive the darkness. We completely conquered it, and we eliminated a terrible evil from the earth. Greed makes people blind, but cruelty makes them foolish. When you treat the people who raised you as disposable burdens, you are not building a future, you are digging your own grave. True family is not merely a bloodline, it is a sacred contract of protection and respect. Those who lock away their elders lock away their own humanity. Never underestimate the quiet endurance of an old man, nor the terrifying lengths a brother will go to protect his own. When you invite darkness into your home, do not be surprised when the shadows finally stand up and destroy you. Did you like my story? Let me know which city you are listening from in the comments below. If you believe that karma always catches up to those who abuse the elderly, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more incredible life stories. See you in the next video with love and respect.